I spent 8 years earlier in my career working on Capitol Hill, and it's Article 1, we're Article 2 in the executive branch, and it will be members in Congress who decide what are the particular plans and proposals that there's enough support to move forward on. And what we're doing from our end is informing that conversation and saying, here's the way you could structure this proposal, here's the way you could structure this proposal to get the most benefit for taxpayer funding and the most benefit from this truly historic opportunity. It really is a historic window to get these kinds of authorities, these kinds of funding streams. And again, we're doing everything we can to be supportive and helpful in those conversations among members of Congress.
You mentioned at the start, it's such a critical moment in time because we are also coming up on the COP26 event. Does the president risk walking into Glasgow with an empty bag of no deliverables to show off to the other countries because his agenda is being stalled in Congress?
Well, I have to say, I feel incredibly honored to be part of this administration because of all that we have done, the proposals that the president has put on the table, and the kinds of very constructive discussions on Capitol Hill. Again, I think it's useful to take a step back and realize what we've done already in this administration, the kinds of goals, the kinds of proposals, the kinds of funding streams, revitalizing things like our loan program. That is literally tens of billions of dollars that can be used to get new clean energy industries up and running and helping communities, promoting jobs in addition to the climate benefits that come from that. So the record already of this administration, I think, is incredibly strong. You look at what was done recently on hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, super pollutants on the climate side. That is an incredibly impactful piece of climate legislation. And as the president has said, and I worked for Senator Biden when he was in the Senate, and I know his legislative skills and I know his relationships up on Capitol Hill. Sometimes Congress doesn't always work as quickly as one might want it to work, but the fundamentals, I think, are there for a deal to be had. And there are very, very constructive, good faith discussions going on. And the president, of course, Secretary Granholm, myself, others of us, very actively engaging in those discussions. So I feel like the U.S. has an amazing amount of credibility in really stepping up to the plate and working with our international partners as well.
So if Biden enters Scotland and says, these are the plans and this is how we're going to be able to meet this very ambitious target of halving the emissions by the end of the decade, is that enough, in your opinion, to get the likes of India or China on board? Because right now, Xi Jinping actually isn't even attending COP as far as we know, and we're even unsure who he's going to be attending in his place. Without China, how much harder is this going to be?
So there's no doubt, Anne-Marie, everybody needs to step up to the plate. Countries need to step up to the plate. The private sector needs to step up to the plate. Financiers need to step up to the plate like never before. The IPCC analysis on the science, our common sense, our own eyes seeing around us. 1/3 of Americans have been impacted and have actually personally witnessed and seen extreme weather and other consequences of climate change already. So everybody needs to step up to the plate. I was just in India about 3-4 weeks ago. Very interesting set of conversations with 6 different ministers, 6 different ministries, and they're going like gangbusters on their 450 gigawatt target for the renewable side of things. And what we had were discussions with them about how what we're doing, especially to reduce those costs of green hydrogen, to reduce those costs of long duration storage, dovetail incredibly well with that 450 gigawatt target. When I met with the Minister of Power, other ministers there, the 2 technologies that they're really trying to push out so that they can achieve that 450 gigawatt target, bring the benefits to the Indian population, not only on the climate side, but energy security, energy independence, was green hydrogen and long duration storage. And that's what we're investing on the storage side, $1 billion a year to reduce those costs. So I think there's actually a nice complementary set of arrangements between us and India and a number of other countries, everyone using their levers as much as we can. But there's no doubt every country needs to step up to the plate. Every country needs to do more, and we all need to move forward. There's no solution to climate change unless everybody's stepping up.
But on China, especially recently, the rhetoric from the highest levels of the government is to scour the market for coal, They're going after everything they can, and their term is energy security. Is it a massive blow about what is going on right now at the energy crisis in China, as well as the fact that Xi Jinping will just not attend?
So there is absolutely no doubt China needs to step up and do more, as other countries around the world need to step up and do more. China's carbon footprint is huge. Around 30% of global emissions come from China. We have seen some progress from China, including the recent announcement to not fund coal projects overseas, but they need to do more. They need to peak well before 2030, which is what their goal is right now, if humanity has a chance of avoiding the worst consequences of climate change. So our hope is we'll do everything we can domestically in the US, we'll actively engage with countries around the world, and we'll use whatever levers we have to try to make progress around the world. But there's no doubt China needs to step up and do more.
Alongside all these conversations about COP26 and climate change and their transition, there's also some uneasiness within the administration, and we reported on this about the rising energy costs. We see this for natural gas. We see this all over the world. And at the moment, there's no crisis per se in the United States, but the EIA says that this winter, if you heat your home with natural gas, you could see your bill increase by 30%. Does the administration have plans to try to ease some of these concerns for consumers and soften that potentially higher bill cost?
Well, the short answer is absolutely. We're paying very, very close attention to the costs on the natural gas side, to oil, to what our U.S. citizens and others pay at the pump. And I think it's important to think about this in two ways. We need to do two things simultaneously, and I think we can walk and chew gum, as they say. One is we clearly need to accelerate the clean energy transition. We need to make those investments in the clean energy technologies of the future at a scale and at a pace that we've not yet done. We need more energy storage out in the system. We need more versatile, clean hydrogen in the system. We need more in a diverse range of renewables into the system. Offshore wind, I mentioned earlier, is an incredibly important renewable that we need more of into the system. There are higher capacity factors with that offshore wind. If you dovetail offshore wind with onshore wind, with solar, with geothermal, with nuclear, you get a mix of clean energies coming into the system with storage, with reliability, with resilience. And so we need to invest more. We need to actually invest more and quicker in those clean energy technologies. And then secondly, we do need to actively manage the existing issues that we have with existing fuels to make sure that they're available, that they're affordable, and they're reliable for consumers. And we have had discussions with our interagency partners under White House leadership on a daily basis over these last days, making sure that we've got the best numbers, knowing what's happening in the US and around the world when it comes to oil and natural gas and retail gasoline at the pump in terms of the prices. So very active conversations, including with private sector, including with state and local governments. The Northeast of the United States in particular is an area that we're paying a lot of attention to on natural gas heating, other sources of heating, to make sure that we're doing everything we can from the federal government side of things to be prepared with our partners to deal with any contingency.
I'm from New York, so yes, the Northeast, it gets very, very cold in the winter, and I imagine consumers are concerned about potentially those heating costs. You talk about gasoline prices. WTI is pushing $84, not Brent, WTI. That's way more closely interconnected with what U.S. consumers will face at the pump. What are the plans in these discussions you're having? Is potentially unleashing some oil from the SPR, is that an option?
Well, it's useful to, again, take a step back and appreciate how we got to this point. And what we saw was the oil market and the natural gas market have huge swings with COVID, right? You'll recall when COVID hit and many of us stayed home. A lot of us are still working from home these days. We had a huge drop in demand for oil, for natural gas, to the point where the prices went to areas we've never seen. We actually saw negative prices, as you recall, Anne-Marie, for a period of time. And everyone was scrambling. I was at the International Energy Agency at the time, where we helped coordinate an extraordinary G20 meeting to deal with negative prices and to deal with really low prices for oil and natural gas. And now as the economy heats back up coming out of COVID, the supply side is lagging that. And so we're seeing these price swings in ways that lead to some real volatility. And so again, we're having conversations with our key domestic industries on this, with our oil and gas producing companies. We're having conversations across the world with a variety of producers and consumers, whether OPEC and OPEC plus or beyond OPEC and OPEC plus producers like Norway, like Canada, like other countries along those lines. And no options are off the table. The president has said that he wants to do everything he can to make sure that we've got affordable, reliable supplies of energy for our citizens, our people around the country, and that's what we'll do. So no options are off the table.
So potentially, if prices go so high, we could unlock the SPR.
So that will be a decision the president makes, the Secretary of Energy makes along those lines. And what we're doing now is helping to inform those conversations with our EIA. You mentioned our EIA, which is a part of DOE, putting out nonpartisan, independent data statistics. So we have the best information for decision making going forward. And we're actively having those conversations with this White House under their direction to make sure that any decision that's made by the president is well informed and will have the impact that we have it. But the president, I can tell you, the president, his senior advisors, Secretary Granholm, all of us are incredibly focused on the impact to consumers and making sure that this recovery coming out of COVID is as smooth as it can be, including with energy supplies and affordability.
Going a little bit more back to natural gas, there's also debate on, and I know the press secretary, Jen Psaki, said, at the moment, we want to continue exporting natural gas. That's actually helping to potentially lower the price in the market. But what would it take for the U.S. to curb or stop those exports of natural gas?
So one thing I think it's useful to emphasize, Anne Marie, is we are in an incredibly privileged position here in the U.S. versus a lot of countries around the world when it comes to natural gas supplies and the current price, right? The current price of natural gas here in the U.S., it's a little more expensive. It's quite a bit more expensive in the Northeast, but it's a little over $5 compared to where natural gas is now, and looking to the futures into the winter in Europe and in Asia, where it's $30 or so. So right now we're producing more natural gas than we use. We're actually storing more natural gas, preparing for the winter along those lines. And we have had a very active trade in natural gas internationally. LNG terminals, around 16% right now of our natural gas goes abroad to a variety of countries around the world. So again, we are having conversations internally with the White House, with our interagency partners, in making sure we're doing everything we can to help, first and foremost, our people here in the United States, but also looking and working with our partners around the world as well.
Will the DOE approve potentially additional export licenses for LNG plants or new plants?
So it's useful to underscore that right now we have around 4 times the amount of authorizations that previous administrations have already made on natural gas than is actually being exported. So right now the constraint on natural gas is really the physical constraint at our LNG terminals. These are huge projects. They cost a lot of money. They take a lot of years to get online. So we actually have quite a hard ceiling in terms of how much natural gas can be shared through LNG to other countries around the world. And we're almost at that physical constraint on that side. What that means, certainly in the near term, is we will have that quite significant price differential where American taxpayers, American citizens will have much, much cheaper gas than other countries around the world.
I have a little bit more also of just a going forward question about natural gas. It is one of these controversial fuels because obviously it's much cleaner than coal, but there's still methane leaks. Environmentalists absolutely hate natural gas. They say it should not be part of the transition. How does the administration view natural gas as a fuel? Where does it fit?
So the way I come at this, Anne Marie, is energy is a good thing. Energy powers our lives. It powers our schools. It powers our businesses. It powers our economies. What we have to focus on is emissions. And we have to have the laser-like focus. We have to have the incredibly ambitious goals that this president has laid out, because that's what science is telling us we need to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. We're spending billions and billions of dollars every year in our country and countries around the world to already deal with the consequences of climate change. As I mentioned, we've got 1 out of our 3 U.S. citizens who personally witnessed, personally experienced these consequences of climate change. And so we need to step up and we need to focus on those emissions with laser focus and accelerate those emission reductions. Now, there's a number of ways you can reduce emissions. Renewables, incredibly important. Solar PV is the new king of electricity. We're seeing the price points on solar incredibly price competitive with coal, with other sources of electricity generation going forward. Offshore wind, onshore wind, geothermal. We think nuclear is playing and can play an incredibly important role going forward. And then there's a range of what's called CCUS technologies that can sequester or utilize emissions coming from natural gas, coming from other fossil fuels, so that we can get the benefits of that energy, but reduce those emissions and dramatically reduce those emissions. We also, on the natural gas side, need to focus on the methane emission side of things. We release way too many emissions throughout the value chain on natural gas, not only here in the US, but Russia and other countries around the world. And we've got to get a handle on that. That's just product going to waste. We need to clamp down on those emissions. And this administration has been and will be incredibly ambitious and aggressive on methane emissions.
And given the higher energy prices, is it feasible potentially the Department of Energy would lift the ban on federal drilling? Is that one of the options that you've been discussing in these meetings?
So that is not a particular authority of ours. That's the Department of Interior and other departments and agencies who have some of those regulatory authorities. We're, of course, part of those conversations and informing those conversations. But that is something, again, this administration is, I have to say, I'm honored to be part of this administration. It's an incredibly competent group of experts who've worked on these issues for years and years, and really relying on and working in partnership with folks who are part of our civil service who've literally served for decades on these issues. And active conversations, of course, are happening all over these issues.
When you look at the administration and the United States' energy sources, we are ranked number 3 when it comes to, and this moves around a lot, but it comes to the production of oil and gas. We have vast amount of resources here, but President Biden wants to be a climate president. Do you find that this message is inconsistent?
Well, again, I think we have to do two things simultaneously, and I think this administration is trying to do those two things simultaneously. To reach our climate objectives, to make sure that we've got the good jobs of the future, the well-paying jobs of the future, revitalized communities. This president has made the most ambitious commitment of any president to reduce our emissions, to revitalize our economies and communities, to have those good-paying jobs of the future in this clean energy revolution that we're in the midst of. But it's an incredibly ambitious set of goals, that 50 to 52% reduction by 2030. Clean electricity, 100% clean electricity by 2035, and a net zero economy by 2050. That's only 28 years. For those of us who are getting a little bit older, 28 years is not that much time to get to net zero throughout our economy. This is an incredibly ambitious set of goals and tasks that are before us, and we need to get going. We can't just set a target out there at 2050 and wait to start working on this 10, 20, 15 years from now. We've got to work day in and day out now in order to reduce those emissions. So personally, I get frustrated when I see some countries and companies and others set 2050 or 2060 targets, but they're not showing that near-term activity with that aggressive, ambitious, but real-world nature to it to really move those emissions down at the scale and pace that we need to. So that's what we're trying to do in this administration.
We have about 6 minutes left, and I do want to get to some viewer questions. And one comes from Andreas in Connecticut. And I know this is something you've been working on when it comes to Earth shots and you're excited about. He says, what are the obstacles to switching to hydrogen? I know you have been doing some research into that space.
Well, thanks, Anne-Marie. What we've done is taken a look at what are the range of technologies, and we're going to need a whole full suite of technologies in order to be successful to get to net zero, not just in electricity, but in transport and industry and buildings across the sphere. We're going to need a range of technologies and technological tools to get us there. So what we've done is we've done a whole series of analysis thinking about what are those key enabling technologies that are so critical to get us to that 2050 net zero. And we're in the midst of launching what we're calling a series of Earth shots. Those technology areas that are critical that we really need to have a full coordinated US government approach, public and private working together to really do whatever we can to reduce those price points, to get those technologies out there and scale. The first Earth shots that we launched was on clean hydrogen, with a goal of $1 per kilogram of clean hydrogen within the decade. That is an incredibly ambitious goal. It's an 80% reduction from where we're at right now on electrolysis for hydrogen produced by renewables. We've got to invest in our national labs. We have 17 national labs that we're bringing to the table to work on these Earth shots. We've got to work public and private to make sure that any solutions that originate in our labs go out to commercial scale as quickly as we possibly can. So I think hydrogen is one of the most interesting, versatile energy sources of the future. It provides solutions not only for heavy-duty transport, for a variety of industrial applications, and we're trying to get on with it with this Earth shot to drive those costs down so that it can be available at scale as quickly as it possibly can be.
Speaking of technology, during the pandemic, we also saw a hack against Colonial Pipeline. Have you seen fresh technology to really fortify our pipelines and our grids from these potential cyber attacks?
So this is something I'm working on a daily basis. We've got an incredibly capable group here at the Department of Energy, working with the White House, working with the Department of Homeland Security, working with our intelligence agencies across the board, and working very much with the private sector as well. On the technology piece, and I know you've spent a lot of time, rightfully so, in my opinion, Anne-Marie, on cybersecurity and these issues throughout your career. From the Department of Energy side, one of the things we're trying to do is use those 17 national labs and try to push these technologies that can be helpful for private sector actors, for the government, for monitoring, for building in resilience by design. So I visited our Idaho National Lab a few months ago, where we're doing some cutting edge cybersecurity research on technologies that are already out there in the market and will be out there in the market going forward. A few weeks ago, I participated with the director, Martin Keller, from the National Renewable Energy Lab to kick off a cybersecurity accelerator where the private sector can come in, use a live test bed at NREL, our National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden, Colorado, to test their new products on cybersecurity. So again, we can get those in the marketplace as quickly as we can. So we're absolutely focused on that.
Is fortifying a fossil fuel grid or pipeline different than potentially cyber attacks against wind or solar?
So what we have to focus on is having cybersecurity by design right from the get-go with all of these technologies, all of these companies. All the processes that we all need to undertake to avoid phishing, to avoid all those kinds of encounters. And we need to have a resilience. We need to have a resilience when those attacks, ransomware attacks or other attacks, come in along those lines. So we are actively working with all parts of the energy spectrum right now. Some of the solutions are more particular to certain sectors than other sectors, but there's a lot of commonality between not only parts of the energy sector, but other critical infrastructure when it comes to cybersecurity. And there's an all of interagency strategy that this administration is pushing on the cybersecurity side of things.
I think I have time for one more. And this question kind of brings us back, David, to the very start of our conversation. And if it's whether or not the Energy Department is still considering using the executive authority on its own for the Clean Energy Payment Program. This is the program we started the conversation with that at the moment is being debated whether or not it's going to go into the reconciliation package that the president supports.
Well, again, Anne-Marie, what we're trying to do is use all our existing funding streams, authorities, and really push the envelope wherever we can on that front. And then secondly, take advantage of this historic window of time on Capitol Hill with the bipartisan infrastructure deal, with the reconciliation discussions that are ongoing right now. There's a number of pathways to get us to where we need to get to. It's an incredibly ambitious goal that's on the table. And so we have to have pathways that are going to deliver. And we're focused in providing technical assistance to our key members of Congress who are leading on these efforts so that we can inform those conversations. But again, we've got to do everything we can with existing authorities, existing funding streams, but then also take advantage of this historic window. And I have no doubt that whatever emerges from Capitol Hill will truly be historic, will be unprecedented, and will be a huge, huge help to what we're doing going forward.
If I could push you on this slightly, would that mean if you're going to open up the entire toolbox, there would be another look, if this gets shut down, to using grants to reward the states to increase some of those clean energy alternatives?
So we work with utilities right now. We work with state governments right now. It's just a matter of scale of what kinds of funding streams that we have available to work with state governments and sending state governments or utilities or others. And there's a variety of discussions right now about how to have different authorities, different funding streams that can work in partnership with states, with utilities, with others in the private sector and local governments as well. So again, there's a number of pathways here, and that's those are the discussions we're having right now with key leaders on the Hill.
All right, U.S. Deputy Energy Secretary David Turk, thank you so much for your time today. And for all of our audiences, thank you for your question and for joining this wide-ranging conversation about what's going on with higher commodity prices to, as we gear up for the U.S. entering the Glasgow COP26, what will they be going in hand? So our very much thank you for his time today, 30 minutes one-on-one. We really appreciate your time. And make sure you stay right here with Bloomberg Live, this new premiere of Policy Blueprint. We have an excellent, a really star lineup of some really critical thinkers coming out of the pandemic.
Thanks, Sam.
Microsoft is empowering governments around the world to deliver extraordinary experiences to the people they serve. Together, we can launch skills initiatives that close the talent gap and drive economic recovery. We leverage AI and data analytics to create inclusive, people-focused services, promoting accessibility and equitable outcomes for everyone. We build trusted government services by adopting the highest standards of security and compliance. And together, we can prioritize new and emerging technologies with sustainability benefits built in, supporting employees to be more productive and have a smaller carbon footprint. At Microsoft, our mission is to empower every government agency and person on the planet to achieve more.
Hi, I'm Deb Kopp, and I'm the president of Microsoft US. Thanks for allowing me to join today. It's just an honor to spend time with this audience and think deeply about some of the most pressing issues facing us all today. We're living in a challenging environment, challenging from a healthcare perspective, economic, and climate. We've got crisis that we're all thinking about deeply. Accelerated by COVID-19, this rapid advance in technology has drastically reshaped how people live, work, and learn. And we're witnessing an incredibly big widening skills and employability gap. And in my conversation with public sector customers, with our private sector customers and our partners, we keep hearing how important jobs are for everyone. If you look at the data, it tells you a lot. By 2025, it's estimated that the global workforce can absorb 149 million new tech and tech-enabled jobs across industries. If you look at an example of cybersecurity in this sector alone, the U.S. has a shortfall of over 300,000 cybersecurity professionals. To fill the jobs, we have to have a workforce capable of performing the work. And if we stick to that example of cybersecurity, 82% of U.S. employers report a deficit of cybersecurity skills among their workforces today. So in this post-COVID world, all people, especially those in the hardest hit industries and the most underserved communities, will need to learn the digital skills to pursue these in-demand jobs in a changing economy. So not only does the skilling challenge impact individuals, we know it has a systemic effect on the ability of companies, industries, and communities to find the talent and thrive in a digital economy. So this challenge is also a huge opportunity. This circumstance, a once-in-a-lifetime generation opportunity for us to think about how we reshape and rethink education from K-12 through college to prepare our students for jobs in the age of digital transformation. At Microsoft, our mission is to empower every person and every organization on the planet to achieve more. And one of those causes is about building skills for employability. We want to create a future in which every person has access to skills, technology, and opportunity to thrive in this new digital economy. It includes job seekers. It includes those that are currently employed but need new skills to continue to grow. And it also includes students who are preparing for jobs of today and tomorrow. We launched a global skills initiative that's designed to help 25 million people worldwide learn the skills for these roles. We also invested $15 million over 3 years to accelerate the work of Black and African American-led nonprofits that provide digital and professional skills to communities in the U.S. We're expanding Microsoft's volunteer program to bring computer science education to 620 high schools in 18 cities. We've also invested $20 billion to advance security solutions over the next 5 years, with $150 million to help U.S. government agencies upgrade protections and expand cybersecurity training and partnerships. To date, our Global Skills Initiative has reached over 8 million in the U.S. to provide them with access to free learning, content pathways to help build these skills for in-demand roles. But our efforts aren't enough. Not one company, organization, nonprofit, or government agency can do this alone. We need to work together. And I'm really heartened that this event is pulling together leaders from public and private sectors to address some of these unique challenges. Our responsibility is to think about how we ideate together and collectively address the educational needs of our communities. We believe focusing on 3 specific key policy areas will create this inclusive economy. One being investing in individuals to attain these skills, includes foundational skills to enabling individuals to use devices, access the internet through more advanced online tools that enable lifelong learning. Initiatives for employees. Public policy should support employers to provide on-the-job training that supports new workers and helps existing workers to advance in their career paths. Those employers need that help, specifically those that are small business. Leveraging the power of innovation and data in this rapidly changing economy, we need real-time information about what jobs are available, what skills will be needed for those jobs, and how to attain them. Innovative public and private sector partnerships can really create information available in a timely and user-friendly way. Ultimately, we believe those 3 things will allow us to collectively generate plans to help people get the skills they need for great jobs, many of which are unfilled today. And these benefits people, the employers, the communities, and our economy. On behalf of Microsoft, I'd like to say a huge thank you for your time and energy in focusing on these important issues today.
Good morning. I'm Rebecca Kern, Bloomberg Government's technology reporter, and I'm speaking this morning with Brandon Wales, the Executive Director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, otherwise known as CISA. We'll be talking about CISA's role in responding to the recent uptick in cyber and ransomware attacks on the public and private sectors. We'll also discuss actions business leaders can take to make themselves more cyber secure and the launch of the new public-private partnership by CISA this summer. To start off, can you share some of the broad lessons learned from the SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline attacks in the past year, and how CISA has helped the private sector respond and recover?
Sure. Thanks, Rebecca, and really appreciate you and Bloomberg for bringing us together. That's obviously covering a lot of ground. There were a lot of things that we've learned from those incidents, as well as many other cyber incidents that CISA has been responding to over the past year. But I want to highlight just 2 of the key ones for us. The first is the lack of visibility. What we saw, particularly in the SolarWinds example, was that CISA did not have sufficient level of visibility in terms of what was happening inside agency networks to be able to spot that malicious activity earlier in that incident. And that is a legacy problem that has grown over time as networks have changed, as the rise in encrypted traffic. And so we've had to begin to adjust our efforts and some of our programs to begin to tackle that problem using new funding from Congress, deploying some new tools and capabilities, and getting new strategic direction from the president when he signed his executive order on cybersecurity back in May. The second lesson learned that I would highlight is what we can shorthand as bad practices. I think what we have seen in too many incidents is that adversaries are able to exploit networks because of certain poor practices that appear again and again. So that could be using out-of-date software that's no longer supported and patched by the vendor. It could be lack of multi-factor authentication on remote access to critical systems, which we saw in the Colonial example. And so CISA has been on an effort to try to convince people and highlight the bad practices that are out there to begin to get them to change their ways. And so it's not just about promoting good practices, but it's about remediating those bad practices. Because even if you've got good practices in a number of parts of your network, if you've got a couple of areas that have weak points, that's where the adversaries are likely to go. That's how they're going to, that's what they're going to use to get inside of your systems.
Right. Yeah. And, if unfortunately a company is experiencing a ransomware attack, what does CISA recommend these companies do right away?
Sure. So, the first point I would raise is, the first time you think about ransomware should not be after you've been hit. By that point, it's too late. You're already going to have a really bad day. Or many days or many weeks. And so you need to begin to start thinking about how do you get ready for a ransomware incident long before it actually hits you. I recommend that every company go look at our ransomware guide. We released it with the multi-state ISAC last summer, and it provides information on how to prepare, and it also provides a checklist on what to do if there's an incident. If you are hit, the first thing you should do is protect your system. If you could take the infected computers offline so that the ransomware may not further spread, you should do that. And third, you should go and get help. And that means notifying the government. Bring your incident to CISA, to the FBI. If there are things that we can do to assist, we will. There are things the FBI, from a law enforcement perspective, wants so that they can potentially go after the bad guys who perpetrated the attack. And then finally, when you're getting help, if your company is not capable of responding to a cyber incident because you've not done it before, we'd strongly recommend that you bring in an outside company to assist you. There are a lot of cybersecurity vendors out there. Find a reputable one who has experience in dealing with ransomware incidents, and they can help you remediate your incident on your network and get you back up and running as soon as possible.
So recommending notifying the government, CISA and FBI too, is where in the process does a company do that?
We would say you should do it early on. The sooner that we're brought in, the more that we can do. And it's also not just about the individual company, particularly from the CISA perspective. We want to know about these cyber incidents that are happening so that we can protect other potential victims. What we often see is that a ransomware operator will deploy malware on a number of networks at the same time using automated tools. And then they'll go into companies one by one, activate that ransomware, and begin to engage with that company on a potential ransom. In that time, there are other potential victims out there who have the opportunity to stop their network from being compromised. And so the sooner information is reported to us, we understand the nature of what happened, the sooner we can get that information out to other people who are potentially victims and protect their systems. And I think that is so essential to protecting this broader cyber ecosystem out there. And so today, your company may be hit, but tomorrow you're going to want CISA to know because we could be protecting you from the next malicious incident.
Right. And in that line of thought, the recent uptick in cyber attacks has spurred Congress to introduce several bills that would require critical infrastructure operators to report cyber attacks to CISA. What are your initial thoughts on these bills? And do you support mandatory reporting?
Yeah, CISA has now been on record going back a number of months that we're supportive of mandatory incident reporting. We have 4 principles that we want to see embodied in whatever legislation is passed. First, that reporting come to CISA so that we can help protect that ecosystem that I just discussed. Second, that reporting be timely, that it come in early so that we have the maximum amount of opportunity to use that information for good. Third, that the definition of a covered cyber incident be broad and allow us the flexibility to further refine it. And fourth, that there be strong enforcement mechanisms to maximize the chance that this information is provided to the government and we can use it to protect everyone.
Yeah. And, you said report quickly. What time frame do you think that should be? I mean, there's been some debate on Capitol Hill. The most recent bills say 72 hours, no earlier than that, to prevent false positives from being reported. Just your thoughts on that time frame.
Sure. So, I think the U.S. government has argued that we think 24 hours is the right amount of time. That brings it in early enough for us to use the information, but does give the company some time to determine whether this is a real incident or not. We would look at some of the major examples when there are these big incidents that are happening. 24 hours is long into the pretty deep into the response cycle already. In the Colonial example, they were already letting their customers know that they were shutting down parts of their pipeline well in advance of 24 hours. And so we do think that 24 hours is a good metric, recognizing that there's other opinions out there. We're continuing to work with the Hill. Ultimately, we think getting the information in is the most important thing. And so if we have to work on a timeline other than 24 hours, we will.
Okay. So we'll see if that bill moves this year. We're hearing potentially NDAA could be the vehicle forward. So also this summer, CISA launched a public-private partnership program known as the Joint Cyber Defense Collaborative, or JCDC. Can you tell us more about that program and the intent behind it?
Sure. The JCDC was adapted from a concept that was recommended by the Cyberspace Solarium Commission when they released their report last year. Congress authorized it at the beginning of this year. The idea being that there is a planning function between the government and the private sector. The JCDC concept that we launched back in August really turbocharges that concept. It's not just planning, but it's more robust operational collaboration between the government and the private sector. And what we wanted to do was bring in those companies that have the broadest visibility into what is happening across the cyber ecosystem, the major internet service providers, the major cloud providers, the biggest cybersecurity vendors, the companies that deploy endpoint detection systems that are seeing things happening across hundreds or thousands of networks across the country and globally. The idea behind it is to take what those companies are seeing, take the ability that they have to take action at a very significant scale, and to marry it up with and harness the power of the federal government, those agencies that are working in the cybersecurity sphere, CISA, the FBI, the National Security Agency, the intelligence community, bring all of that together so that as we are seeing new things, whether on the government side or the private sector side, as we're seeing incidents start to emerge, as we're seeing campaigns begin, we can harness the information we have together, and we can take action at a scale that no company or government agency can take individually. All of these companies and governments working together, we now have the ability to take action to protect the cyber ecosystem in a way that no one can do individually. And we're already seeing that pay dividends. It's early days. We launched it back in August. We are still working on some of the initial efforts focused on cloud incident response and ransomware. But we've already been using it to work. And as we see incidents, sharing it with our JCDC partners, they're doing the same with us. And collectively, we're able to take collective action much more quickly and much more broadly. And we think we're doing real value in protecting our networks today.
Can you share some of the names of the companies partnering? I understand Microsoft, Amazon, we have some big tech companies. And then are you guys looking for more industry groups and companies to partner with you still?
Sure. So I think we had a concept. We've got about 14 or 15 plank holder members. So some of the big cloud providers like Microsoft and Amazon and Google, some of the major internet service providers like AT&T and Verizon and Lumen, major cybersecurity firms like Mandiant and CrowdStrike, some of the big equipment manufacturers like Palo Alto and Broadcom and others. So there's a number of real, I think, critical partners in the IT world, in the cybersecurity sphere that are partners with us, it will grow over time. These are our kind of plank holder members, and we're proving the concept working with them. But we already have concepts for how we're going to move into the future, look at other areas, particularly in certain critical infrastructure sectors, whether that's in the energy space or in the financial services world, places we want to build out to better protect those critical functions that they're performing, and we will do so throughout 2022.
Yeah, and do you imagine a work product on cloud or ransomware to provide to the broader industry and other private companies that this group will be recommending? What are some of the near-term efforts we may be seeing from JCDC?
Sure. So in some cases, you're already seeing products that benefit from the collaboration between the government and the private sector through the JCDC. So yesterday, CISA, the FBI, and NSA released a product on black matter ransomware. And it includes information that was provided by our JCDC partners and information that was worked between the government and some of our JCDC partners. But we are going to be releasing additional products later this year, particularly on cloud, that will benefit from the engagement with the critical cloud players that are members of the JCDC, and that work will continue. And we really think that this concept and the JCDC really adds tremendous value to the cybersecurity advice and recommendations that we've long provided, that we'll be able to enrich that with additional information that's only available to these private sector partners.
And you referred to yesterday's joint advisory from CISA, FBI, and NSA that identified black matter, which is reportedly located in Russia or linked to Russia as the actor that hacked several agriculture operators this summer. Can you walk us a little more behind the scenes on that effort that was advised yesterday? And do you expect, or are you guys planning to do more of these joint attributions and advisories in the coming months with FBI and NSA?
Absolutely. And we'll continue to do so. We released one several weeks ago on Conti ransomware. And I think that is really the value that CISA is trying to bring to the table. As we are seeing new ransomware operators, as we're seeing new malware variants out there, we will take that information, work it with our government and industry partners, and then get it out to the broader community, to all of our stakeholders in the public and private sector, whether in the federal government, state and local governments, or industry, so that they can use it to enhance their security of their own systems and networks. So you should expect more of that to come.
Great. And also this summer, Congress confirmed Jen Easterly to be CISA's director and Chris Inglis to be the country's first national cyber director. How are these two leaders working together so far? And how are they drawing the lines of distinction between their two jobs?
Sure. So, the relationship between the National Cyber Director and CISA is absolutely fantastic. And the president could not have picked a better inaugural National Cyber Director than Chris Inglis. And we are really pleased to have him as a really important partner to our agency. And I think he has spoken really eloquently about the role that the NCD performs, which is very focused on ensuring unity of effort in the federal government, making sure that the government's efforts are integrated and coherent. But that's substantially different than the work that CISA does, which, we're an operational agency. We've got more than $2 billion budget, more than 2,000 employees, some across this country, and they're working every day, looking to detect adversary activity hitting our networks, to develop products that can help shape behavior and provide information to our partners. We're building capacity across the country on security and resilience. So that's real operational work that our folks are doing every day, responding to incidents. And that's substantially different than the work that the National Cyber Director is doing at the strategic level. Both are important. They need to be closely linked up. And that's what we're doing. And the relationship between Jen and Chris is absolutely excellent. but we really don't see any competition. We really see this as a team effort. And, we've often called cybersecurity the ultimate in team sports. And I think that's embodied by the working relationship we have with the National Cyber Director and our other critical partners, whether it's the FBI and NSA, as represented by the releases that we did, as we just did yesterday, and the ongoing work that we're doing with those agencies every single day.
Right. And what actions do you recommend companies take today to become more cyber secure? What are your top tips from CISA?
So, I'll give you a couple of top tips for companies, and then I'll give you a couple of tips for individuals. In some cases, they're overlapping, and in some cases, they're a little bit unique. I'd say for a company, the most important thing to do is to take stock. What do you need to do to make sure that your company is cyber safe and secure? If you're the leader of your company, have you spoken to the people who are responsible for your IT and your IT security? Do you have a plan for what to do if you are impacted by a cybersecurity incident? Have you exercised that plan? Have you put in place the right level of technology, given that the risk that your company has faced? Are you using CISA's products to help you identify if you have put in place the right practices and you've avoided the bad practices? We've got a product called our Cyber Essentials that is really designed particularly for small and medium-sized businesses or small governments, but it's certainly useful even as you get into the larger companies, particularly to push to your supply chains. But it kind of walks through step-by-step the things that you should do to make sure that your company is safe and secure. Recommend folks search for Cyber Essentials on the CISA website, and it's a real valuable tool. For individuals, there are kind of four things that we continue to recommend, and we've still got another week or so in Cybersecurity Awareness Month, and we're trying to make sure that individuals out there are aware of the role that they play in the cyber ecosystem, the things that they need to do to protect themselves. So implementing multi-factor authentication on as many accounts as allow it. Current studies show that could protect as much as 99% of cyber incidents. Update your software, making sure that you have automatic updates turned on, really important. To be wise when you click on emails. Phishing is still a significant threat vector. A lot of adversaries continue to use phishing, and they're getting even more sophisticated. So really think before you click on links or attachments in emails. And finally, use strong passwords and use a password manager if possible, because those can really protect your systems, particularly protecting against attacks where an adversary compromises one password, then reuses it over and over because you've used the same password on too many accounts. So those kind of simple tips can help you protect yourself.
Right. And so we'll move to some audience questions now. We have one from John from Virginia, and he's asking, how can companies who are in the electric sector, the electric grid, which is obviously largely operated by the private sector, what can they do to become more cyber secure and mitigate potential threats to infiltrate or compromise the grid? Obviously, this isn't a hypothetical anymore. We had a massive cyber attack on Colonial Pipeline this summer, which led to massive lines at gas stations all along the East Coast. So, what specifically are you recommending for these energy companies? Obviously, there's ongoing efforts with TSA, which is all under the umbrella of DHS, where CISA sits, with cyber directives directing them to report. But what more is CISA doing with that energy sector?
Sure. So, the question asked about the grid, and I'll hit that, and then I can touch upon pipelines. The energy sector is one that we've spent a lot of time working on. And it's one where there is a tremendous amount of engagement, starting even at the heads. The CEOs of major electric power companies have been meeting for the last several years on cybersecurity issues and have really raised the game. And when it comes to the cybersecurity of the electric grid, on the one hand, these energy companies are a lot like any other companies. They operate business networks, and so they need to adopt the same type of network security that everyone else should be doing. But on top of that, they operate these operational networks that use industrial control systems to control the flow of power and regulate the the systems and the generating units and other critical infrastructure on their networks. And those require kind of special handling. CISA operates an entire ICS security program. We work really closely with the Department of Energy on this. We put out a lot of information for companies that need to make sure that their ICS systems are protected. So oftentimes there's kind of a dual effort inside these companies, what they need to do to protect their business networks, and then what they need to do to provide even more security on those operational networks that can have a real impact on the power grid. I think what you saw from the security directive that TSA released that applied to critical pipelines is really what they need to do to help secure their business network, and then additional levels of protection that we expect on operational technology systems, which can be complicated to operate, which have kind of unique cybersecurity challenges. So if you are operating in that space, reach out to CISA. There's things we can do to help. There's information we can provide, a lot of times in partnership with the Department of Energy and others, to make sure that you are protected.
Yeah, another audience question is from Dimitri, who points out that a lot of our world is connected by the Internet of Things, or IoT. So what can be done to make sure we're still more secure with IoT as well?
Yeah, that's a great question, and obviously a complicated one, because the proliferation of these devices that are now network enabled. And I think we have seen historically a number of years ago where someone weaponized the vulnerability in Internet of Things to create a very significant botnet that disrupted traffic on multiple parts of the internet. But I would say that you have to look at this from two angles. If you are a network operator and you're going to allow devices on your network, you need to think really hard about how you create a network that can protect itself if you're allowing these devices on where you are not securing those individual devices. This is really the thrust behind a lot of concepts like zero trust, what you can do to secure your network and make sure that anything that has access to your network, you understand you're regulating the privileges that those devices have to your systems. And if you can't trust that device, you need to lock it down so that it minimizes the amount of damage it can do. On the other hand, there's a lot of work that we're trying to do with vendors. There's work that I know Congress has looked at in terms of standards for IoT devices. That work is critical because we need to make sure that the devices that are coming in have some level of security built in. And so that is a long-term problem. There's not an easy silver bullet solution today. And really this falls upon network operators to make sure that even if these devices are brought in, that there is very little that they can do to actually harm the overall security of those networks.
Thank you. And then another question we have is from Charles in New York, who's asking, how can companies share data with the government to ensure more security in the supply chain, but also asking, what are some obstacles to sharing data with the government,
Sure.
in reverse?
So, I think that, we have tried to address as many obstacles as possible when it comes to information sharing, whether it's liability protection, which we received back in 2015, how we protect the information. That being said, when it comes to regulators, I would strongly encourage you to engage with the regulators themselves. They often have very specific information requirements that they are going to levy upon their regulated community, and those are going to vary from company to company and from regulator to regulator. I don't want to kind of get into the middle of that, and I think what every company should ask for is as much clarity as possible about the nature of the information that they need and the specific data elements that they want, so that they can provide it and avoid any concerns in terms of potential regulation and enforcement.
And another question from Paul in New York is, how is the digital transformation different in the government sector versus the private sector? How is CISA evolving? Even if you could talk to how you guys as an agency are operating remotely in pandemic. How are you trying to keep up with the private sector in terms of your digital transformation?
I would say in many respects, the government and the private sector are going through the same digital transformation. The pandemic obviously accelerated that significantly with the move towards much more aggressive remote work, a much larger remote workforce. I think that the government, I think the government's advantage is that for a long time, we've had fairly strong cybersecurity regulations about what we can do. We had the Federal Information Security Modernization Act, FISMA, that provides some guidance. There's a lot of requirements that come down from CISA and from OMB on the operation of federal networks. A lot of those requirements don't exist in the private sector. And so there's going to be a lot more variation in terms of how the private sector goes about securing its systems. Now, there are going to be a lot of companies out there that are doing amazing job securing their networks using innovative practices as they've moved to remote workforce. But what I would just recommend is that as companies are moving towards a growing remote workforce, think about the new vulnerabilities and weaknesses that may introduce into your system. How are you securing those remote devices? What kind of privileges do those devices have? How does this affect your ability to manage and secure your network? Is your security workforce remote, meaning that they're, with all of their elevated privileges, accessing your network, and how are they doing so, and what additional controls do you need to have in place to make sure that adversaries won't exploit it? And because we have seen for the length of this pandemic, extremely aggressive activity from both nation state and criminal actors looking to exploit the digital transformation, hiding in VPN traffic, using devices that don't have multi-factor authentication for privileged access. Time and time again, they're exploiting these digital transformations. So think long and hard about what you're doing and the tools and techniques and capabilities and systems you need to have in place to make sure that you're not exploited.
Yeah, and we're going to wrap up really quickly, but I wanted to see if there's any kind of last takeaway for companies in the private sector that if they had to do one thing to be more cyber secure, what would you recommend, or would you reiterate that you may have already said today?
Sure. So, there's no silver bullet in cyber. This is all about layers of protection. And so think about inside of your network, inside of your system, what do you need to do to enhance its security? It's not going to be one thing, although there are critical ones that I've mentioned, like multi-factor authentication and others. But just think through what you need to do. What are the layers of security you're going to put in place from both a technology perspective, a people perspective, a process perspective? Cybersecurity is a problem-solving discipline. It's about thinking through what are the weak points, what I need to do to secure myself, and how do I make the adversary's job harder so they skip on and they go on to the next guy. And so that's the advice I'll leave you with, and I think it's sound ones for everyone listening.
Thanks so much, Brandon, for your time today.
No, thanks, Rebecca. Really appreciate a great discussion.
Hi there, I'm Josh Wingrove. I'm a White House reporter with Bloomberg News. Thank you for joining us. I'm here this morning with Claire Martirana, who is the Chief Information Officer for OMB and one of the, if you will, White House gurus with regards to information security. Claire, thank you so much for joining us today. Happy Cybersecurity Awareness Month here in October. I want to just ask broadly for you to help set the landscape for us. We are living in an increasingly digital age. We're living with increasingly digital threats. We are all working from home far more than I think we would like to most days. And so what does that make for your job? You have so many moving parts, it seems, these days. What are the priorities for the Chief Information Officer in this sort of era that we're in terms of digital work?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Josh. As Federal Chief Information Officer, this is a broad portfolio. Full of quite a few challenges, but also a lot of opportunities. Along with the federal CISO, Krista Russia, I work closely with the federal CIOs and Chief Information Security Officers, CISOs, across government to ensure that federal IT is secure and on a path towards IT modernization. so we can deliver simple, seamless, and secure customer experiences to our citizens. So this role has a really unique vantage point. So what I'm seeing is we're strong across the federal enterprise, but where we really need to rally is with our partners across the government and the private sector to continue to bolster our cybersecurity efforts. And thank you for pointing out that it is National Cybersecurity Month.
Yeah, and we're all celebrating it in our own way, I'm sure. As in your role, you're chair also of the board of the Technology Modernization Fund. This is a pretty big effort, got $1 billion from the American Rescue Plan to try to sort of grease the skids, if you will, and improve cybersecurity, improve cooperation between silos, which, dare I say, maybe don't speak to themselves or speak to each other as easily and smoothly as possible. You announced some awards from that a couple of weeks ago. What is the purpose of this fund? What are some of the agencies and initiatives that are getting funding from it? And what do you hope is achieved with that?
Yeah, the TMF is an extraordinary opportunity with the $1 billion we received from the American Rescue Plan with the focus on cybersecurity and COVID-19. I think one thing I'd start with is the relationships that we have across the government are incredibly strong for our cybersecurity efforts. We have National Cyber Director Chris Inglis, Ann Neuberger, who's the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cybersecurity, Director Easterly, who is at CISA. They are really my partners, along with Chris DeRusha, the federal CISO, working with this whole community. So the TMF, the Technology Modernization Fund, had originally been funded with several $100 million, and it was agencies were required to pay back in full whatever money they were loaned to go on their IT modernization journey. With the American Rescue Plan, Congress provided us with $1 billion. And really the focus was to address the most urgent IT modernization challenges and to bolster our cybersecurity defenses in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis. So it's a great start in developing this modern, secure framework. But in a way, it is a down payment because we have a large federal enterprise and a lot of needs across that have been represented through the inbound proposals that we've received from agencies.
Can you give us any hint?
Yeah, I was going to say, sorry to jump on you there, Josh.
Yeah, no problem.
I can give you a little bit of a background on some of the project proposals we received. So in March, we received the $1 billion, and we worked with our congressional stakeholders and through the FedCiv side of OMB to provide some repayment guidance for TMF. So originally, you had to pay back 100%. We realized because of these emergency circumstances that we had some repayment flexibility guidance that we could provide to agencies. So we structured the repayment model to be from full repayment, which is still totally appropriate, all the way to minimum repayment, which would represent the most urgent cyber needs of an agency that they weren't able to reprogram money immediately to deal with. So in most cases, being a former federal CIO myself, when something urgent came up, you pulled whatever levers you had available throughout both your IT budget and your agency budget to deal with the most urgent needs. So many agencies moved out immediately post SolarWinds using that posture, but then realized that they had a lot more work to do in the cyber front. So we've received over 100 project proposals from, I think, 40 plus agencies that represented about $2 billion in requests. And of those, about 75% of the requests were for cybersecurity.
What is the timeline for some of this? You had the awards from a couple of weeks ago. Do we have more on the horizon? And how do you choose which ones get it and which ones don't?
Yeah, we actually, at the end of September, we announced kind of the first round of awards, $311 million to 7 different projects. They cut totally across agencies. addressing immediate security gaps, and improving the public's availability to access services.
So it seems like part of the job is, part sword, part shield, if you will. You're playing defense, globally at a time of rising threats, but you're also trying to equip these agencies to function in a world where, people are going to access more services online, in particular because of the pandemic, but of course for a range of reasons. How do you make that sort of split between that part defense, part offense?
Yeah, it's a great question. Most agencies focus immediately on the defense, right? When you're dealing with an attack in one segment, we learn from each other. We communicate really effectively across the federal FedCiv environment. And so I would say that they were primarily defensive, but we're really switching our posture to offense. We published out a zero trust strategy very recently as part of our cyber executive order. So in September, we released for public comment a draft strategy to move our government towards zero trust cybersecurity. And for those that aren't familiar with zero trust, it refers to a security model where instead of us concentrating on our defenses in our networks at the perimeter, we're treating the network and the people and devices that are using that network as untrusted and even potentially compromised. So
it means, employees have to log in every single time, for instance. It means two-factor authentication, I suppose. Tell us more about what zero trust means for the government.
Yeah. So with zero trust, along with the president's cybersecurity executive order that we issued a little bit earlier this year, we're asking agencies to make it significantly harder for even the most sophisticated adversaries to compromise an organization. So a unique thing that we did is we shared our draft strategy, even though we were under very tight deadlines, and we're requesting public comment. So in just 2 weeks, we received over 100 submissions, and the comments and feedback we know will make this strategy stronger for the American people. So to the public listening to this, I would say this is your government, right? We are the people, you and me. Follow our progress, hold us accountable, and continue to engage with us as we work on modernizing our government. I would also recommend to people in the business community to look at the cybersecurity executive order on whitehouse.gov. It contains very tactical deliverables that everybody should be considering when protecting and securing their environment. It really serves as a roadmap, and it will provide reassurance that we're doing what we should be doing. And it should highlight for you what the actions you should be taking to safeguard and secure your network and your enterprise.
So let's maybe jump in on that. I mean, for people watching, what can their companies be doing? What can their agencies be doing? And particularly at a time of, COVID, I mean, if you have more and more of your colleagues and workforce working remotely, I imagine that just adds fuel to the fire of the need to go to zero trust type systems because you have more entry points to your network. What is the advice you can give them other than, start yesterday and get going on this?
Exactly. And I think you did touch on a couple, right? Two-factor authentication, really simple, basic cyber hygienes. Take a few minutes personally on your own devices to turn on multi-factor authentication on your email, on your social media channels. Be aware of what scams look like. If you are shopping online, which most of us do, especially under telework circumstances where we're home a lot. If you are really desperate to buy that bath mat online and you click on a link and you get a security warning from your ISP or your browser, pay attention to it. They have extraordinarily sophisticated teams managing these networks on our behalf as customer, for us as customers. So make sure that you are paying attention and not just dismissing those as annoying security warnings. Also, I would say, for government interactions, look for .gov, the official government website addresses. In emails, check for misspellings. all of us have a part to play in keeping both our companies safe and our personal lives safe and secure.
Can you speak broadly to the trajectory? It feels like the risk is rising, but also more diffuse. But perhaps that is focused on my side of the chair, if you will, catching up maybe a little late. And, how does the risk today compare? And what is the trajectory looking like in terms of the cybersecurity risks that we're facing as individuals and as agencies, corporations, governments, what have you?
Yeah, I think, there have always been nation state actors playing on this playing field. So that has not changed. I think one thing that I'm observing that is a little bit different, you now have complete digital natives coming of age and participating, right? They have innate talent in dealing with everything digital. And so I do think that we have a little bit of a different threat vector there with digital natives, working for nation states. This is really the general population that are able to be a bit more sophisticated when it comes to all types of cyber activities. So again, I would say it really comes down to personal security, is making sure that you are using these basic tools, password managers, really basic things that should eventually become competencies that we're teaching in school for how people should be thinking about interacting with social networks and digital services of all kinds.
So let's talk more then about government services. What through the pandemic were we able to change? I mean, a lot of, the government had to scramble to do a lot of things very quickly, PPP loans, that sort of thing. What were we able to change to make that go as smoothly as possible? And what did we learn about it in terms of going forward? I mean, are there lessons to be learned from COVID when it comes to regular annual tax filing, if you will, where that public interface can be smoother in an online setting?
Well, you're hitting on pretty much my favorite topic of all, which is customer experience. And in the Biden-Harris administration, we believe that our customers, our citizens and the American public, have to be at the center of everything that we do. Our citizens deserve a secure, simple, seamless experience anytime they interact with the government. When they ask a question or renew a passport or apply for a grant, the experience should be easy and intuitive, similar to the experiences that they have in their everyday lives with customer brands and apps that they're using on their phones. Mm-hmm. So over the past 18 months, we've seen private sector companies really pivot and maintain and improve, in some cases, that service that they've delivered to their customers. And they've invested heavily in designing and launching new digital tools and experiences. We're also doing the same thing in the federal government. We know that technology powers an exceptional customer experience, and we were able to do things in certain instances in days and weeks under COVID versus months and sometimes years, doing things like moving to digital signatures, adding functionality on websites when offices were closed for certain services that had previously been in person. But I think you're just seeing the very tip of the iceberg, because we are focused across the entire administration, just like we are on zero trust. We're asking agencies to make a significant shift in the way that they're thinking, so that they focus on how we deliver services to our customers, not on who delivers the services. Because if you think about it, the federal government, while it's one big org chart, we transit different agencies, and you shouldn't have to know the org chart of an agency that you're interacting with to try to get the benefits or services that you deserve, and in many cases that you've earned. So in some work that I did at the VA, we really broke down those silos of the business units and just focused on the veteran. What could we deliver for the veteran? What was the veteran trying to accomplish? and how did we work together as an enterprise to deliver the best digital experience for the veteran. And we are seeing that across the entire federal enterprise. And I think in the next couple months, you'll see some additional information coming out from us that's focusing on those user experiences and journeys that really intersect multiple agencies.
You use the word journey. It feels like we're still pretty early on that journey. Give me your sense. Like, how much more work do we have to do on that? It seems like in a lot of corners of government services that it is not, 2021 when it comes to web services. You're playing catch up in many ways. And where are we on that journey?
I think we might be playing catch up in some instances, but it's also a really unique opportunity because a lot of the problems that I have seen since I joined government, I've been in government for 5 years after a whole career in the private sector, and none of these problems are technology challenges. We know how to do technology, right? That's the easy part. Much of the challenge is the policy, the process, the people, and the procurement that are the complexity of the operating environment that we're in. So we are really trying to stay focused on making sure that we're aligning all of those things. Our intention to deliver a more seamless, secure customer experience, but recognizing that we are going to have to modernize many of our policies and procedures in order to move out more rapidly to solve some of these problems. But if COVID was one thing, it was really the catalyst for us really improving digital services across government.
So let's circle back then to the TMF, that Technology Modernization Fund. I mean, what is the timeline for giving out the rest of that $1 billion from the ARP, and is it enough?
As I said, it's a down payment. There is no question that there is such an enormous demand for us to modernize many of these high value assets and legacy systems. But just having a legacy system does not necessarily preclude you from building better front end customer experiences off of a legacy system. And sometimes that's a really great tactic to use to create the momentum needed sometimes to align people to move out on the hard work, which is modernizing a lot of those legacy systems. So TMF, in a way, is really the best seed funding we could possibly make for us to make some of these strategic investments in areas where we know we can have significant service improvement, increase the cybersecurity posture, modernize those high value assets that are really the foundation of operating a safe and secure government. We have really scaled the PMO, the Project Management Office for TMF, and are reviewing with a board that consists of full-time federal technology experts that are really donating their extra time for us to do all of the reviews of the initial project proposals and then move out on these final project proposals that then would lead us to an award. So it's a pretty rigorous process, but what I get excited about it is for two reasons. One is we're adding a lot of the rigor up front to be able to choose projects that have the best chance of success, and they have the best chance of us learning things from them that we can scale across the government. Writing playbooks, doing really great digital tactics that would allow us to share the knowledge that we learn. And then the second is how we surround the project with capable people to make sure that we have a higher chance of success, that the project is going to get out the door and be fully implemented. So I think those two things, the vetting up front and then surrounding the project with technical talent for us to be successful, is really a winning formula for both TMF and IT modernization in general.
What's the timeline for the next set of awards? Weeks, months? Can you give me any hint of that?
I'd say weeks. I mean, we are working every single week on the portfolio. Right now, we're looking at the backlog of projects. Some of them less complete than others in their submissions. So, excuse me, we are working with those agencies to make sure that their submissions are in the best shape possible for us to be able to make an informed decision.
Can I just back up as we near our close here? What worries you in your role in the day-to-day about whether governments can do this fast enough? The president likes to say that autocracies are watching the U.S. and other democracies to see if they can, move fast enough to tackle big challenges, and he uses this as a stump speech essentially to, push support of his program. What do you see the ability of the U.S. and other democracies to be able to pivot quickly and try to tackle these risks, these challenges, these opportunities?
Yeah, it is incumbent upon us to actually move out quickly and decisively and improve the service delivery to the public. Trust is at an all-time or a low point, and we know that delivering great quality services actually improves people's confidence in the government. Additionally, I think another issue that I work on a lot is talent. Is recruiting talent into the government, making sure that we have great technical talent coming from the private sector to partner with our really competent federal workforce to be able to move out in a much more adaptive and agile manner, taking some risks, really pushing forward in areas where we know that we can have significant service improvements to deliver better services to the American public. So that talent part is a big part of what I think about every day and work on. And also, I think really making sure that we're improving service delivery, full stop.
Sounds like you got a lot to focus on. Claire Martorana, Federal Chief Information Officer of OMB, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Josh. Have a great day.
You too.
I want to welcome everyone to a panel that addresses the key issue of the day, supply chain disruptions with the labor shortages that we have seen and some of the dynamics of a market still trying to turn back on after the pandemic. There is nobody better to speak about this than our next panelist, Robert Sanchez, who is the chairman and chief executive officer of Ryder. It is a company with 40,000 employees and really handles this key issue, which is how do we get stuff from one place to another? How do we connect the dots in a world that relies increasingly on just-in-time delivery and the transportation of goods? Robert, I want to just get started with the idea of these supply chain disruptions that we have continued to see and how you have observed them from your unique and frankly highly privileged perspective of being at the heart of it.
Yeah, Lisa, thank you. Thanks for having me. Look, Ryder's, as you mentioned, we're involved in supply chain activity. We're involved in just about every industry supply chain in North America in one way or another. So we do everything from leasing and renting a fleet of trucks to actually running private fleets for companies that are doing deliveries. We have 250,000 vehicles that we provide to customers. We employ about 10,000 commercial truck drivers. We also run big distribution centers for companies. We've got about 300 distribution centers that we run with about 14,000 warehouse workers that work in those facilities. And more recently, we also offer final mile delivery of big and bulky products. So we really touch a lot of different parts of what's going on. And clearly what we've seen over the last 18 to 20 months is really unprecedented. If you think about global supply chains for different industries, they're really like an orchestra. And it's an orchestra that's playing a symphony. And that symphony has been refined over many years. So if you take the retail industry, for example, you've got suppliers in Asia. You've got shipping companies that bring those supplies across to North America. You've got ports that then, through trucking companies, deliver them to distribution centers for retailers who ultimately deliver them to the retail store and more direct to consumers' homes. So this thing has been running for a long time. The players know their part. There's a lot of planning that goes into these supply chains. And there's a movement of goods, there's a movement of information, and there's a movement of funds that happens as a normal course of business. and everybody knows their part and kind of works well. The orchestra works well together. But if you think about what happened last year, the music stopped, and all of a sudden you had, folks in the orchestra that needed to go do something different because they didn't have the job they had before. So you think about in the auto sector, where auto production shut down for 6 months. I'm sorry, for 6 weeks, not 6 months, 6 weeks. It was unprecedented. It had never happened before. So you saw semiconductor companies that were providing semiconductors to the auto companies, they pivoted and they started providing semiconductors to consumer electronics. And as we were all moving in to our homes and buying new computers to be able to work from home, there was a spike in demand for that. You remember the rush for hand sanitizers and masks. All of that kind of shifted, and you had even people that were in the supply chain, think about food and beverage business, had to shift away from restaurants and more to people eating at home. So if you think about back to that orchestra analogy, there was a big shift in the music that was being played, and the orchestra, the band kind of moved around.
Well, right now, what we're hearing, just before you go on, hold on one second, because this is sort of how we got to where we are, right? The idea that this nuanced orchestra, as you put it, that took decades to develop, got shut down, and now it's going to take time to come back on. Where are we in the restarting process? How much longer do we have?
Yeah, look, this thing doesn't get fixed overnight. In the supply chain business, we deal with disruption all the time. You have natural disasters. Think about hurricanes, earthquakes. You have traffic. You have weather situations. So supply chains have to respond when these things happen. It's typically when there's a bottleneck somewhere. The way you solve these things is you have to throw resources at it. You got to throw people at it. You have to throw more resources at the situation. You have to synchronize across the supply chain. So if there's opportunities to divert a good somewhere differently to alleviate the problem, you need to do that. And then you need some time. And that is kind of what we're in right now. So this does not get fixed overnight. It does probably get worse before it gets better. I think what we need here is continued synchronization among the players and additional resources. As you heard last week, there was talk about opening up third shifts. Those are absolutely things we need to do to expand the capacity, certainly at the port level. And then the rest of the supply chain, which is a lot of what we're doing, the rest of the supply chain needs to continue to operate so that once that bottleneck gets resolved, there's not another bottleneck that shows up somewhere else. So, yeah, unfortunately, this thing is going to be around certainly through the end of the year. It's going to probably get a little bit worse before it gets better. But the important thing is that we take the steps to provide the right resources that we need to get through this.
When you say throw resources at it, I think paycheck. I think how much is compensation going up, especially as we hear about all of the shortages of drivers, particularly truck drivers out there in order to get things around. How much are you seeing wages going up, and have they gone up enough to actually sate the demand for drivers?
Yeah, wages are going up, but we do have a more systemic problem with the driver shortage. And the driver shortage is, you're hearing a lot about it now, but in the industry, we've been dealing with this driver shortage for at least the last decade, and it has clearly escalated over the last 18 months. It is a problem because of the demographics of folks. There's more people. We have an older population in the driver workforce. We have a move away from driving as a profession by younger people that has also impacted us. So a lot of it is now, how do we expand the pool for drivers long term? The short term, there isn't an easy fix. I mean, the government can do several things, I think, in the short term to alleviate it. In some cases, maybe expanding the number of hours that a driver can drive, especially as we're trying to get stuff out of these ports. Also, I think helping to expand the pool of young people that want to become drivers. One of the challenges with commercial truck drivers today is that you can't be a driver crossing state lines with a commercial vehicle unless you're 21 years old. So somebody coming out of high school that wants to go into the trades probably can't choose commercial truck driver because they can't take on the full responsibility of driver till they're 21. So lowering that age to 18 with the right safety requirements, I think, is a big opportunity for us. And the other thing I would tell you is immigration. That we need about 60,000 additional commercial drivers in the U.S. today. Over the next 10 years, we have to hire over 1 million truck drivers to offset the retirements that we're seeing. You're going to need a lot of help in order to do that. I think it's going to require more people coming in, young people coming in. It's going to require some work from immigration as qualified drivers from other countries can come to the U.S. to take some of these unfilled jobs, and then expanding the pool, bringing more women into the to the professional driver workforce. These are jobs that pay on average $60,000 to $65,000 a year. You can make over $100,000 a year as a professional driver, so they are well-paying jobs. As you mentioned, there has been an increase in pay and wage inflation, which I think some of that is helpful in attracting more people. But wage inflation alone isn't going to solve the problem.
What about on the flip side? And this has been one thesis that people have, that the longer these labor shortages go on, the more people look to technological solutions. And I'm thinking about Tesla and the self-driving truck. How much is that a realistic solution from your vantage point?
Yeah, Riders, we're very involved in that. We've partnered with numerous companies that are in the autonomous truck space. I do think that will become a reality. When? It could be in the next 5 years, maybe a little bit longer than that. And in certain lanes, I would tell you, too, certain functions. So on highway from one ramp to another is more likely. It's a simpler autonomous solution, if you will. So I do think autonomy will be part of the long-term solution. But there's still going to be plenty of jobs needed to be filled for doing final mile deliveries of those products. And even in areas where autonomy may not work, probably more likely to happen in the South where you don't have as many weather conditions as you do up in the North. So it's going to have to be a combination of all those things, of which technology will be part of it.
In the meantime, something that you said before that I want to dig a little further into, this idea that you think that the supply chain disruptions will get worse before they get better. Can you give us a sense of what worse looks like? Is it just more expensive, or is it just much longer delays and empty shelves for a longer period of time?
Yeah, I think it could be a little bit of both, right? Certainly longer delays and empty shelves, especially as we get now into the holiday season, as we try to break these log jams, and also suppliers begin to ramp up on the things, on those critical items that we're in need. So it is a combination of both of those. I think going into the holiday season, this is going to be a very different holiday season in terms of we're used to having plenty of supply of the things that we want. I think this year is going to be a little different. But the good news is this is transitory. We will get through this, whether it takes us, 1 quarter or 2 quarters or 3 quarters. The truth is these issues do get resolved. There's a lot of incentive for all the players in the supply chain to get this right. So I'm confident that, we'll work together to get that done.
On the other side of this, how different does the supply chain look?
Well, I think you're going to have a few things different. I think, there's a lot of lessons learned here. So I do think you're going to see supply chains get shorter. So, maybe more manufacturing brought closer to the point of consumption, because that gives you a lot more ability to react quickly. So more onshoring and nearshoring of manufacturing, I think, will be an outcome of this. There was a bit of a trend already happening, but I think this could accelerate that trend. I think certainly you're going to see more inventorying of parts. I mean, we have situations today where automobiles that cost $60,000, $70,000 are on the sidelines because of a semiconductor that might cost $1. So inventorying those semiconductors, or those components that have the semiconductors, as opposed to having ultra lean supply chains, I think is going to be a movement that we'll see coming out of this as companies become more sensitive to, what the impact of a shortfall of a product that they had historically viewed as always available is going to be.
What did you think of President Biden's speech when he talked about some of the supply chain issues and how he plans to remedy them? You spoke about keeping ports open longer so that would be helpful. What didn't you hear from him that you wanted to?
Well, look, I think I applaud him for the coordination effort. Unfortunately, these things require a lot of speed you want to get them done very quickly, and the government historically is not the fastest moving enterprise. But I do think that the coordination between the port authorities, the labor, trucking companies is certainly welcomed, and we need more of that. I think also They should look at relaxation of certain rules that may be keeping drivers from driving longer, maybe keeping certain types of vehicles out of the ports in California because of emissions. That can help to speed that up. I think longer term, it's really the issues around. I'd love to hear them talk about how they can help us resolve the driver shortage issue longer term with, as I mentioned, adjusting the age for when young people can become commercial truck drivers. Smart immigration reform could really help the situation, and really focusing on those types of legislative changes that I think can help us. Also, anything that helps nearshoring and onshoring of manufacturing type activity, I think ultimately can help prepare the supply chains for what this is going to look like when we get to the other side.
It's not just a logistics perspective here. It's also a question as we go into COP26 of the emissions footprint, as you talk about ferrying around a lot of goods with diesel-fueled trucks. How are you adjusting to emission standards and sort of retrofitting certain types of either warehouses or trucks with devices that can potentially reduce the footprint?
Yeah, look, the whole purpose of our job is to refine the supply chain and make it as efficient as possible. So just by its nature, we're reducing emissions. But clearly, technology changes that are underway around electric trucks, electric warehouse management equipment. We're in the forefront of that, too, working with some of both the traditional truck manufacturers and some of the startups on helping to introduce those to the marketplace. I think we're still some years away from getting that becoming a reality. Light duty delivery vans, we see that as probably the first class of vehicles where you're going to see electrification. But there's still a lot of work to be done there. We're working very closely with these organizations and helping to introduce them into the marketplace. So we're excited about it because we think it really presents a great opportunity for us to lead the change, if you will, as that technology evolves and really becomes valuable for our customers.
I just find it amazing that we're dealing with all of these log jams at a time of profound transformation. And we're seeing this highlighted probably best in the oil industry, given how much prices have surged simply because there has been an underinvestment in plants that are deemed as old-fashioned or, out of line with respect to emission standards. So we're dealing with these rising costs at a time when we also are dealing with the higher costs of disruption from labor shortages and the idea of just where things are coming from and COVID. From your perspective, how much more on average are costs for people to ship things now than in the past? And I say this because I wonder whether the consumer is prepared to pay for that.
Yeah, it really depends on what you're moving. But when you look at freight cost and spot freight costs that have gone up in the last year, 25% in some areas, 30%, that's a meaningful increase in the cost of shipping. And companies do different things to try to offset that. They run their own vehicles if they can. They look for alternatives. They outsource to companies like Ryder. I mean, one of the things that we're seeing is when all this disruption is really creating a big opportunity for companies like Ryder, that this is what we do for a living. So we're going to have record sales this year as companies have all said, hey, I'm having a tough time. Let me go find somebody that can help me. So that's what we're here to do. We're here to help companies figure out how do I mitigate? Like we can't eliminate some of these market cost increases, but certainly helping to mitigate those costs. But I think what you mentioned about fuel costs, I think, is an important data point because we all want to move to lower emissions, greener technology, but ultimately there has to be an economic value proposition for businesses. Because what we've learned, and over the years we have, provided natural gas trucks to our customers, hybrid trucks, and what we've learned through that process is that everybody wants to move to the, zero emissions, but they're not going to do it unless it provides economic benefit to them, and that's where the technology needs to get to. And I think that's the piece that still requires some time: is how do I get the battery costs down? How do I get the infrastructure so that these greener technologies really don't provide inflation and provide harm to the economy as opposed to helping?
When do you think that we'll actually be at a place where we do see that economic dynamic spurring people toward more greener types of energy?
Yeah, on the commercial truck side, I think right now the closest is the light duty delivery van. So you think the delivery vans are delivering, e-commerce packages to your house. Some of those could be. They're getting pretty close. They could be there in the next year or two. The larger medium duty trucks and the larger tractor trailers that you see, those are still quite a ways away. The cost is still significantly more for the vehicle, even when you take into consideration the savings on fuel costs. So that is, I think, much further out, probably more. It could be up to a decade away.
As we talk about supply chains, I have to wonder China's role in this, given some of the harsher lockdowns and given the fact that in many ways they have been a factory to the world. How much can people really diversify away from China, given their presence in this entire ecosystem?
Yeah, it can't happen overnight. And certainly some of this started with the tariffs that we saw a few years ago that started to really create, had companies begin to look at this issue. And I think the tightening, if you will, around the economy that we're seeing in China, I think is making companies think twice about continued investments or the investment of the next plant, whether they're going to be there or try to be here closer to the U.S. where the consumption happens. So I think you're going to see over time, it doesn't happen overnight, but you're going to see more of the newer investments start to happen on a North American basis, whether it's U.S., Mexico, or Canada, and less on the Asia side. Again, it's a combination of what's happening from a geopolitical standpoint, but also an outcome of this pandemic and the need to really respond quickly to what's happening in the supply chain. You can do that better if your supply chain is shorter.
Well, how realistic is that? Because this is something I've heard conflicting points on. Some people say, yeah, you're going to see more onshoring and more localized factories. And other people saying, well, really, it's very difficult to do that, not only from an expense standpoint, but from an expertise standpoint, and that people are still going to China. And, Vietnam is sort of the popular offshoot to China for some of these production needs, and it remains so and hasn't really gone down that much. Is that the truth, or have supply chains shifted much more away than people realize?
Well, you could have supply chains that are shifting within China, right? I mean, within Asia, that are going to China, as you mentioned, to Vietnam and Thailand. You are seeing some of that. But you are also seeing supply chains now that are moving closer to the U.S. and more towards North America. There is a labor training issue that needs to be addressed. There's a broader labor issue beyond truck drivers, just manufacturing expertise. And that's something I think the government can help with also around training programs to be able to ramp up the workforce in the U.S. and in North America to be able to take on some of these jobs. But it can happen. Just like the jobs went away many years ago, they certainly can come back. And I don't think it's not going to be an all or nothing, but certainly incrementally moving more towards North America, I think, is a high likelihood of happening.
We just have a couple minutes left, and I do think about the just-in-time delivery system, and we have to really touch on this transformation in the economy where people expect to press a button and then get it on the doorstep within the next hour. I wonder what you see as Amazon's role in the delivery mechanisms, in logistics going forward, given how much they've transformed our idea of how we get goods and when we get them.
Yeah, clearly they're going to continue to be a big player. I mean, they are the big player in e-commerce, but as with any great business and industry, you're going to see new players pop up. You're going to see more companies move into that final mile delivery space. I mentioned that we are already in that space for the stuff that your typical parcel company doesn't move. So you think about furniture, fitness equipment, and appliances. Ryder moves those today to people's homes. We're also looking to get into that final mile e-fulfillment of broader type products that are smaller and really competing with some of these companies and helping our customers compete with them. So we're excited about that. That takes a while to ramp up, and that's what we're in the process of doing. But it's gonna become a competitive landscape as what typically happens. But clearly, I see Amazon continuing to be a big player, if not the big player in the space.
Have you found that it's increasingly difficult to hire competitively?
Well, that's one of the benefits I think Ryder has is for the jobs that we provide. Think about, we talked about truck drivers, warehouse workers, diesel technicians. We have a very extensive driver recruiting network. As you said, we've got over 40,000 employees. So we view it as an advantage for us in a difficult hiring environment. We're typically able to find and hire qualified truck drivers where companies on their own may have a challenge doing that. Same thing with technicians and warehouse workers. So we view it, yes, it's an ongoing challenge. I think it'll continue to be, but I think it's also an opportunity for Ryder to help other companies that may not have this capability.
Have you been interested in making any acquisitions? And I ask from the vantage point of a lot of M&A that's been out there, and the fact that having this scale is all the more important in a position of your type.
Sure. No, we're certainly actively looking at acquisition opportunities, especially around the supply chain and logistics space. We view over time really that portion of the business of the company becoming a larger percentage of the overall Ryder story. So where we can acquire not just new customers, but where we can acquire new capabilities in the supply chain space. You think about, as I mentioned, the e-fulfillment, where you're more doing that final mile delivery of parcels. We're looking at that as an opportunity. New industries, we're heavy in automotive and industrial and retail and consumer packaged goods, but other industries that we can serve, we want to get into. So yes, we are actively looking at M&A and as a way of helping to bolster the growth of the company.
Well, I just want to thank you for taking the time with us, because this has been a tremendously educational conversation for me, and I'm sure everybody listening. Robert Sanchez of Ryder, the chairman and chief executive officer, at a time where supply chains have never been more in front and center. I will say I've been looking through the earnings statements, and every single company practically puts supply chain disruptions, material shortages in their list of risk factors, in their list of reasons why their margin costs have been going up pretty significantly. But we wish you the best of luck. Thank you for taking the time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Lisa.
So the question that we really wanted to answer with this project was, the same types of vaccines in places, the Western developed economies, which are highly vaccinated, are we seeing a different impact in these places, or is the effect of the vaccines really the same? And so what we did was to take the places that had vaccination coverage of over 55% and bigger places, so populations over 1 million. And then we further narrowed this to a group of places that have seen a wave of cases pre and post vaccination. In some places, vaccinations seem to be able to bring deaths down to a much bigger level. And the question really was why, and what can the world learn from that? So, of course, there are many factors that affect fatalities. The analysis is really only looking at the impact of vaccination. There's so many other things that do come into play, of course. But some of the big takeaways that we could see in that contrast between places that really managed to get deaths really down after vaccination was the length of the interval between the first and second vaccine dose did seem to play an important role. So for the European countries that managed to bring fatalities down to just 10% of what they were at the previous peak, we saw in places like Denmark and the UK and Germany, for example, they were administering vaccine doses 6 weeks apart. In the UK, that was up to 8 to 12 weeks apart. Whereas in places that have brought deaths down to a smaller level, the US, Japan, Israel, they were administering vaccine doses only 3 to 4 weeks apart. We've seen that those longer intervals actually do boost the immunity level much higher. We've seen this now from studies. The second dose is more powerful when the first dose has been given that time to fully mature in the body. And that could play an important role. And there's a lot of lessons there for countries that are now still ongoing their vaccination campaign. And so what happened to those earliest vaccinated countries? By the time Delta came through and started spreading across the world, those initial doses, we do see the immunity has already waned, and that could have played a part in the fact that vaccination did not provide as strong of a shield towards Delta compared to other countries. So, I mean, the global vaccination campaign is still ongoing. There are so many countries, especially in the developing world, that don't have any meaningful vaccination protection at all. And with the virus becoming endemic, we do know that vaccinations may become a regular thing. What this analysis can tell us, is to give scientists, policymakers, an inkling of some of the things that can be done to strengthen that shield of immunity against new variants. Because as we know, there is a great fear that Delta is not the only new mutation.
Bloomberg Live, our global events platform, is premiering a virtual event called Policy Blueprint. This inaugural event focuses on the question, can government and private sector work together to solve the big problems better? And we welcome now Dr. Albert Bourla. He's chairman and CEO of Pfizer. So, Dr. Bourla, thank you so much for joining us. When I think about big problems, we haven't had one as big for a good long time as COVID-19. There was cooperation between the private sector and government. I know you did not take money from Warp Speed, but you worked closely, continue to work closely with the government. Give us your sense of the status right now of the battle against this pandemic.
Yeah, and to start with, I think that this collaboration was pivotal, and we may not have taken the money, but it was a different collaboration. It was collaboration with the FDA, it was collaboration with the CDC, it was collaboration with NIH in terms of making sure that we conduct the studies the right way, and without their, let's say, collaboration, I don't think we would be able to do that. So the private-public sector was pivotal. Now, news about the pandemic, I think as we had predicted it, this virus is here to stay for quite a bit because has been spread all over the world and has this ability to create mutations and variants. But as also had predicted, we should be able to have it well under control as long as we get vaccinated. I think in the world, large parts of the world are getting vaccinated right now. I believe that within several months, almost the entire world will have enough vaccines to get vaccinated. And those countries that hesitancy of vaccines is small, and those tend to be more highly educated, let's say, nations, I think that we will be able to go back to a normal life.
So, Doctor, before we turn to the world, I do want to talk about that. Let's talk about the United States and a couple of things that are pending right now. One is, people call it mixing and matching. That is with respect to the booster shots, getting a booster shot potentially of a vaccine, which is not your original vaccine. Where are we from what you know about where the FDA is on approving that mixing and matching?
I think they are considering the data. There are data that were presented to them, I think, by NIH, Dr. Fauci's lab, did the studies. They are very reliable studies, smaller numbers, but very reliable studies. I think they have done all different combinations. For example, us boosting J&J, Moderna boosting J&J, and then J&J and us boosting Moderna, and then J&J and Moderna boosting us. In terms of Moderna, they are using the full dose, not the half dose. And I think they are reviewing the data and they will make their decisions.
So you know the data, you've looked at the data, and I don't want to rush the FDA, I don't want to rush the government, want them to be careful. But from what you've seen, is it pretty clear we should be mixing and matching just to make sure we maximize the boosters across the board?
I think that it's safe to say that boosting, mixing and matching could work, and that could provide flexibility.
The other thing, Dr. Bourla, that people are very concerned about is children. And let's start with 5 to 11-year-olds. That is pending. I know Pfizer has submitted data. When do you expect a decision on that?
I expect pretty soon. Actually, I expect before the end of the month. Why I say that, not because I know how long FDA takes, but I know when they have scheduled their advisory committee, and it is before the end of the month. And typically in all these cases, FDA makes decisions within 3-4 days max of the advisory committee. So I think it's a question of weeks.
So assuming that that's right, Doctor, when should parents think that they could actually get their children vaccinated? What's the lag time before we actually can get shots into arms, assuming, again, that it gets approved?
Assuming it gets approved, we will be ready to provide this new formulation. It is a different formulation than the one that we are using for the adults. It's using 1/3 of the mRNA as a dose. And so we have done all the work to manufacture it at scale so that we will be able to provide it almost immediately.
Let me push it back even further. What about 2 to 4-year-olds? Are there data being gathered on that? Do you expect at some point we will be able to inoculate even children as young as 2?
I do expect to do that. Of course, the studies needs to be completed. I'm optimistic because I have seen these results between 5 and 11. For the 2 to 5 years old, the studies are ongoing right now. I think should be completed by the end of the year. And it is another formulation is using a very small fraction of the mRNA that we are using with adults. It's 2 micrograms compared to 30 micrograms that a normal dose compares, or 100 that Moderna's dose contains. So these 2 micrograms, I think we expect to be very, very safe and give good immune responses. So also those kids will be protected.
Well, let's turn now to the rest of the world that you raised before. Everyone agrees we need to get the entire world vaccinated at some point in order to protect all of us, because it travels across borders, goodness knows. What's the best way to do that? As you know, there's been a lot of pressure on Pfizer and on Moderna to free up the intellectual property. I know you said in the past that's not necessarily the most effective way to get the job done.
Not only the most effective, has nothing to do with the availability of vaccine at this stage, and actually will be a blockage. But let me go to the positive. I think what needs to be done, it is that we will have enough product manufactured so that will be available for all, and to provide it at cost, that at prices that everybody can afford. Those are the 2 conditions, so that the entire world will be vaccinated. When it comes to the second, it's easy. We have resolved it a long time ago. We are providing the vaccine at the cost of a takeaway meal in the high-income countries, but in the low-income countries, we are providing the vaccine at half of this cost. And the middle and the low-income countries, we are giving it not for profit. Even going further, we signed an agreement with the US government that we will provide them 1 billion doses of our vaccine at cost, and then the US government in turn will provide it to the poorest countries of the world at free, completely free, 0 cost to the governments of the poorest countries. So with all of that, I think pretty soon the availability will change completely and dramatically in the other countries. The manufacturing, it is right now, we are standing at, we have made more than 2 billion doses, and we have released a little bit less than 2 billion, because it takes 1 month from the day we make them until we release them for quality controls. From this 1.7, 1.8, almost 550 has gone to low and middle income countries. By the end of the year, we will have released 3 billion doses. By the end of this year, which is in 2 months. And 1 billion or more, and likely will be more, will be given to low and middle income countries. And then, of course, next year, 4 billion doses that will go to the entire world. So I'm optimistic that will be enough doses for all, and everybody could afford it.
Dr. Bourla, as you know, having the vaccine is a necessary but not sufficient condition to get people inoculated. What about the delivery mechanism, particularly in some of the countries that are middle income, lower income countries? What can be done to overcome that? Who's working on that part of the problem?
I think that should be the main concern of WHO, particularly for the poorest countries, to make sure that the infrastructure, the hospitals are there. I think should be, of course, the responsibility of their governments, but also the responsibility of non-governmental organizations, that they should support building a medical infrastructure. So when the vaccines arrive there, they will be able to administer it. There is a lot of work going on right now on the ground, but still, I think they are not all these countries ready yet, unfortunately, but I think we need to make sure that we continue these efforts.
Finally, just to wrap this part of it up, Doctor, as you know, I have Pfizer. I got Pfizer, my 2 doses. I haven't gotten a booster yet. I haven't got the booster yet, though. How important is it to get that booster? Have you gotten your booster?
I did got my booster. I did it before I take a 2-week trip to Europe. It was quite high risk. I was going to see a lot of people. I went to 5 countries, if you include Vatican as one country. And I did my booster of the 3rd dose. And I think that there are clear recommendations in this country. People that are 65 and above, they should all do it. And people between 18 and 65, they should do it if their occupation creates exposure to them. Also, of course, if they have underlying conditions, all they should do it. So there are different recommendations that are changing over time in different countries. I'm telling you what it is, the recommendation in this country. And, if you fall into one of these categories, I will urge you to do it as soon as possible.
Dr. Bourla, let's turn now to what comes next. As you said at the beginning, this virus is not going away. We're not past the pandemic yet, but we have made a lot of progress. What about the next pandemic? Let me ask you particularly about the coronavirus, because the coronavirus seems to come back in different forms through history. Does this mRNA platform potentially offer a vaccine that could cover all coronavirus?
I think that the mRNA platform has the ability to adapt very quickly. I don't think that we have proof that will be effective against all coronaviruses, but I think that we have very high probability to do so. But when thinking about pandemics, we should not be thinking only about coronavirus. A pandemic can come through very different types of viruses, and not necessarily respiratory, could be other type of disease as well. And if there is a lesson that we learn from this pandemic that stands out among the many that we learned, it is that we were lucky because we had a vibrant life sciences sector that was able to step in and produce solutions. Solutions when it came to respirators, solutions when it came to diagnostics, to therapeutics, and to vaccines. And I think it is critically important to learn this lesson and make sure that we create the policies, given that also this is about public policies, this discussion, the policies that will create innovation, will make innovation flourish. So when and if there is a next time that we need science to win, we are in a position of strength.
What are the policies, in your judgment, that would actually facilitate that climate of innovation so whatever comes next time we'll be at least in a better position to handle it?
I think there are multiple. Let me start with what you started your question about regulators. I think we have seen tremendous achievements by having the private sector working regulators to produce life-saving vaccines. The question is, if we were able to do it for COVID, why not for cancer? If we were able to submit a request to FDA and receive an answer within 3 days rather than within 3 months, why we shouldn't be able to do that when we're submitting a request and a question for a cancer vaccine in the future? That will require significant resources to be given to FDA and, of course, significant structural changes maybe. But I think this is the time to do it because now we know that it works. The same comes to how we will make sure that there is a thriving life sciences sector, and the intellectual property is a very big part of what drives significant amount of capital thrown into this sector. Unfortunately, it's not goodwill that will bring cure of cancer. It is billions of dollars that are invested by people that they are willing to spend again and again and again for 100 projects until one of them will be successful and 99 will fail and they will lose their money. This is the reality that we are living. So these are significant questions for policymakers.
So, Dr. Bourla, you mentioned cancer a couple of times there, which is awfully tantalizing. Explain the science to me because I don't understand it. Does the mRNA breakthrough that this represents, can that possibly help us on cancer?
Yes, it can. There are a lot of efforts are ongoing for years right now, even before starting for vaccines. The cancer is growing like a foreign body within your organization, but somehow they have a mechanism that is able to evade the immune response of your body. So your body doesn't recognize it as a foreign body, like a virus, for example, so it can attack it. And there are a lot of efforts that are happening how to mobilize your own immune system to fight your cancer. One of these efforts and one of these technologies is by using the mRNA. There are also vaccines that you can use or immunomodulators, but this is one of the quite promising approaches. Hasn't given yield fruits yet, but it is heavily studied as we speak.
So, Dr. Buller, you've described some of the climate that you think that we need to have flourish in order to make sure we can deal with the next disease. Talk to us about something that we've heard a lot of in other contexts, and that's supply chain. Was supply chain a significant hindrance for Pfizer? Is it a challenge to this day? And if not, how did you make sure you had the sufficient supply chain?
It was a major challenge in the beginning of the pandemic. Keep in mind that what drove governments to do was to create the protectionism. So they started restricting imports and exports. And our vaccine is made of 186 different components, 186 different components that are coming from 19 different countries. And you miss one of them, you can't have the vaccine. So everyone is as important as all of them. So we had issues in getting some of these raw materials, either because, of course, of all, we scale up manufacturing capacity very rapidly, and there were not enough suppliers in the world to provide them, but also there were, let's say, trade barriers. That was not good, and eventually everybody loses when we try to do that. So I think maintaining during pandemics and during periods of crisis, open trades, it's very, very important, and that very important for all.
One of the things that we have heard recently, coming out of the pandemic, frankly, is that we need to diversify our supply chain. Is that something that's important in the pharmaceutical area, to have more than one country that maybe could supply some of these?
I think it's always good, particularly in periods of crisis like this one. For example, when we started, we have two separate lines that they were twins. One, they were both doing the same things. One in the United States that was supposed to provide vaccines all the way to the Americas, from Canada all the way down to Latin America. And the other one in Europe that was supposed to provide the European continent, Asia, and Africa, all the way to Australia. And this is how it worked in the beginning. Now we are mixing more. So we are sending from the US to Asia and from Europe to Latin America as the production lines are, let's say, as the production is allowing us. But it's very important because you can't have only one manufacturing site doing it. Imagine if an earthquake or something creates an issue, you can't risk something like that.
Dr. Buller, you described some of the atmosphere we need for innovation in the pharmaceuticals area. And I wonder about one government policy that's being suggested, proposed by some right now, and whether it would affect our ability to deal with the next problem. And that is some limitations on prescription drug prices. That's something, as you know, that comes up periodically. It's up again on Capitol Hill. If, in fact, they went forward with that, would that constrain the industry's ability to respond to the next pandemic?
If they come in the form that they are discussing, yes, absolutely. But let me clarify a few things, because that's a very important issue. I think we do have a very big issue with drug pricing in the United States. I think the Americans right now are paying for their medicines like if they don't have insurance, although they do have. But let me explain how the situation is. The total healthcare cost and of pharmaceuticals within the total healthcare cost is 12%. The governments, for example, will pay, the US government or the commercial plants are paying 12% of the total cost for medicine. So by definition, that cannot be the big issue. The issue is that when it comes to medicines, the Americans have to pay it almost all out of the pocket. And in fact, in inflated prices, because the list prices are almost double than the net prices that we are providing to insurance companies. That needs to change. And I am in favor of all radical changes that will ensure that the out-of-pocket cost of the patients is reduced right now. That could mean incremental cost. And Pfizer and my peers, CEOs, the industry is willing to participate and pay big part, if not our fair part, very big part, more than the fair part, of this cost. But what we don't want to do, which is some of these proposals are doing, it is they're taxing significantly the industry, enormous amounts that will just go to the black hole of the federal budget rather than go to the out-of-pocket. For every dollar that they take from us, if it goes straight to the pocket of the patients, they will have our blessing.
So just to make sure we're clear, because this is a terribly important issue to a lot of Americans, what you're saying is, okay, we can certainly live with some caps, some limitations, and reductions in drug prices, as well as the beneficiary of those reductions is the patient rather than the federal government.
This is exactly what I said. If it is the beneficiary, as long as the beneficiary is the American, the patient that is paid when he goes to the pharmacy, we are willing to do more than a little. We are going to do a lot.
So, Doctor, one last one here. I mean, Pfizer is, for many people, a hero right now for coming up with this vaccine, as well as Moderna is, but Pfizer is a real hero. Are people just beating down your door to come work for you? I mean, we hear a lot of problems about recruiting new people. Are people just flocking to Pfizer right now to say, we want to be part of that team?
Yes, they do. I think it has created tremendous momentum for life sciences in general. So it used to be times that young people really had an affection to work for the tech industry. They wanted to study things that are related with the tech industry. They wanted to work in these, let's say, mega companies of tech. The pandemic and the fact that the life sciences sector demonstrated the value to society has reversed the situation. More people want to study now, science and medicine, and they want to work for us. And we see that every day. And particularly for Pfizer, because of the reasons that we explained, we have the benefit of attracting now the best. And I'm very pleased about it.
Well, good for you. Thank you so much, Doctor, for being with us today. That's Pfizer Chairman and CEO, Dr. Albert Bourla, joining us for Bloomberg Live's Policy Blueprint. Coming up later this hour, Delta Airlines CEO Ed Bass.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Victoria Cumming, Head of Global Policy at Bloomberg NEF. We are the primary research arm for Bloomberg and have a team of 250 or so people spread around the world. And today I'm going to talk about the upcoming UN climate talks in Glasgow. What do we expect to come out of COP26? Are government's emission targets sufficiently ambitious? And some talk about progress on climate finance. So, ambition is probably the #1 hot topic for Glasgow. As I'm sure you will recall, the Paris Agreement aims to hold the global I'll just start from the beginning. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Victoria Cumming, Head of Global Policy at Bloomberg NEF. We are the primary research arm for Bloomberg and have a team of 250 or so people spread around the world. Today, I'm going to talk about the upcoming UN climate talks in Glasgow, COP26. What do we expect? Are government's emission targets sufficiently ambitious? And will there be progress made on climate finance? As I'm sure you all recall, the Paris Agreement aims to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. And to realize these commitments, the world needs to reach net zero emissions around mid-century, according to the 2018 report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And since that report was published, we've actually seen a flurry of new national and regional net zero targets, as you can see from this slide. So the top donut chart that you can see on the right shows the status of when it was the beginning of 2020. And by now, there's a significantly larger chunk, accounting for about 75% of global emissions, are now covered by such a target, whether it's in force or under discussion. So Bloomberg NEF is relatively optimistic that parties will reach some kind of deal where they reference global net zero in Glasgow, and potentially also what seems to be the catchphrase of the conference, to keep 1.5 degrees alive. Now, one reason why COP26 is possibly the most important climate summit since 2015 is because it's the first opportunity for countries to discuss their climate pledges to 2030. These are known as nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. And unlike under the Kyoto Protocol, parties determine their own contribution to the Paris Agreement goals. And so this discussion is the first step in the pledge review ratchet cycle agreed in the Paris Agreement. So the next step will be the global stocktake in 2023, when parties will review their progress with a view to them preparing their next NDC and, in theory, ratcheting up their ambition. However, Bloomberg NEF does not expect all NDCs submitted before COP26 to lead to global emissions in line with a 1.5-degree target. So comparing emission targets is tricky because countries use different types of target and different deadlines. So we've used possibly the simplest method, which is to compare the implied change in absolute emissions between 2010 and 2030. And as you may recall, for 2 degrees, we're looking for a 25% reduction on 2010 levels. And for 1.5 degrees, we're looking for a 45% reduction. Now, the figure shows that 4 G20 countries or parties are on a path to 1.5 degrees if they achieve their NDCs. However, even though Japan has recently announced a more ambitious target, it would only still be in line with 2 degrees. However, for nearly half of those countries, hitting their 2030 targets would mean they would still see an increase in absolute emissions. And because the G20 includes such major emitters as China and India, the group's emissions as a whole would be on track to rise 45% on 2010 levels by 2030. So that's a far cry from what's needed under the Paris Agreement. The other thing to mention is that some of those countries that even have ambitious emission goals, they have yet to actually implement concrete policies to achieve those goals. So notable examples of that are Australia and Brazil, where they appear relatively high on the chart on the left, but less high on the chart on the right. The chart on the right is taken from Bloomberg NEF's 2021 Zero Carbon Policy Scoreboard, which ranked the G20 countries in terms of their decarbonisation policies. So if we look at the impact of the NDCs submitted so far on global emissions, if achieved, they would still see an average rise of 16 to 19% on 2010 levels. So that would mean a temperature increase of 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. We also expect another priority in Glasgow is to be some kind of a deal on coal power. We've seen a number of related announcements in the last year, notably the G7 leaders agreed in July to end support for unabated international thermal coal power generation by the end of 2021. And notably, China said that it would end building new coal power plants abroad. Now, a comprehensive and global commitment to ending the financing or construction of coal power plants would make a significant contribution to climate change or tackling thereof. So coal-fired power generation accounts for about 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. But if parties in Glasgow do reach a coal power agreement, to be meaningful, it will need to be comprehensive and to avoid the vague wording and undefined loopholes that we've seen in previous commitments. For example, the G7 pledge may have looked good on paper, but loopholes could mean that it would still allow higher efficiency thermal coal technologies without abatement. Likewise, they didn't define what they meant by the limited circumstances under which the countries could still provide support. And as you may have spotted, the China announcement only relates to overseas plants, whereas it actually has plans to add considerable amount of capacity at home. So let's now swap to the other priority topic for Glasgow, which is finance. So in 2009, developed countries pledged to raise $100 billion a year in climate finance for developing countries. The deadline was 2020, and that target was reconfirmed in the Paris Agreement. However, by 2019, they were still $20 billion away. So data collection for finance always runs a bit behind schedule. So if we assume the same growth rate was maintained from 2019 to 2020, they would still be $10 billion away from that $100 billion. And it may have been even lower than that because of the requirements of the pandemic. So as a result, we don't expect that $100 billion a year target to be met in Glasgow. But it's worth flagging why it's particularly important. This isn't because of the actual sum raised. So $100 billion a year is small fry compared with the trillions of dollars a year in total annual investment that's needed to meet net zero by mid-century. It's important mostly from a diplomacy perspective. So climate finance is in essence developed countries' main leverage in the COP negotiations. And the risk is that by the lack of progress could weaken developing countries' willingness to collaborate and to take on more ambitious targets. The attendees to the July UK ministerial on COP26 stressed the importance of the goal by saying that it was key to the trust, credibility and confidence in the whole UN climate change process. And the situation was made worse by the G7 summit in July, when those leaders agreed to actually delay the target to 2025 without consulting anyone else. They did agree that they would put forward new climate pledges, however, and some have done so, as you can see from this chart. So given that we don't expect the $100 billion a year target to be met in Glasgow, it's going to be crucial that countries can agree on a timeline and process for achieving it. By September this year, the pledges that you can see in the chart total just under $190 billion a year in public finance over the next 5 years. So that averages $38 billion a year. As you can see, the G7 members, apart from Italy, top the table for absolute funding pledged. However, if we compare them on a per capita basis, some of their pledges look less impressive compared with other countries such as Denmark, Iceland, and Switzerland. If we assume that private finance and export credit funding maintains their historic trend of growth, this could mean that in total these pledges would amount to some $50 billion a year, or $236 billion over the next 5 years. So well behind on the $100 billion. Now, Canada's and Germany's environment ministers have been tasked with developing a plan to reach the $100 billion a year goal. So it will be interesting to see when they publish at the end and their report at the end of this month. So as well as agreeing on how they reach the $100 billion a year, parties in Glasgow will also need to determine how and when they decide on their next climate finance targets. And one of the biggest areas of contention could be if there's a proposal to impose obligations on recipient governments, as been alluded to recently. And if this happens, then it's likely that developing countries will point to the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and to Annex 1 parties' contribution to historical emissions. Another issue that could be contentious is whether dedicated funding streams should be created for adaptation and certain countries which have historically missed out on a significant share of the financing. So one of the reasons why mitigation tends to attract more financing than adaptation is that it can be difficult to prove a business case for an adaptation project. There's also room for improvement in terms of geography, because the least developed countries have on average only received 15% of the financing in the last 5 years. So we don't expect parties to agree on some kind of fixed carve out, but we could see them agree to increase financing for these areas, provided they can decide by how much. So overall, in terms of ambition, any deal from Glasgow is likely to reconfirm a global net zero and some kind of a wish to keep 1.5 degrees alive. But we don't expect the NDCs to mean global emissions would be in line with those thresholds but for 2030. And even countries that have ambitious targets have yet to implement concrete policy support. But we could see some kind of deal on coal power front. And in terms of the finance, developed countries may well not come to Glasgow with pledges totaling $100 billion a year. But their willingness to agree on how and when they will meet this target will be vital to maintaining trust with the developing countries. And areas of potential contention could be whether there's obligations on recipients' governments and dedicated funding streams. And with that, I say thank you very much for joining me. If you're interested in reading some of the research behind this presentation, go to BNEF on the terminal or about.bnef.com to access the reports shown on this slide and to learn more about our research. Thank you very much.
I'm Joe Doe, a metals and mining reporter for Bloomberg News. With me today, I have Barbara Humpton. She's the president and CEO of Siemens USA. Barbara, thanks so much for being with us.
Joe, it's great to be with you.
So let's just get right to it. There's a $1 trillion infrastructure package being passed around Congress right now. They have many objectives, including improving American competitiveness, and that's going to either be through investment in infrastructure, as well as a bill that might have some implications on U.S.-China relations. I guess my first question is, does this legislation, if actually passed, will it actually improve American competitiveness or have any effect whatsoever on it?
Well, yeah, and let me begin by just sharing with the audience 2 words about Siemens so that everyone understands why we view infrastructure investment as so critical. We are a technology company, and we've been in the backbone of the American economy for over 160 years. And we're focused on the kinds of technologies that transform the everyday for everyone. Things like bringing digital tools into manufacturing, things about making buildings more sustainable, making transportation more efficient. So these are areas that are obviously in the thick of infrastructure, and we've had a loud voice when it comes to this investment in infrastructure. Some things I'll share with you about whether, in fact, this will make a difference. The answer is a resounding yes. We already know that a dollar spent in infrastructure will yield an economic return of $4. And we have the ability now, by investing in critical infrastructure like ports, airports, train systems, to make our transportation of goods and services more efficient, more effective. And we have the ability now to look into some other areas like the manufacturing base to ensure America is ready for the future.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, where are these dollars going?
Yeah, the current plan is that, especially in the bipartisan infrastructure framework, the plan is that we will be investing in what you think of as classic infrastructure. Think roads and bridges. Think about those things that we have used for the last century to help us form the foundation for our economy. And what I'm proud to say is that the Congress has included some measures that would actually prepare us for the next century of American leadership, like digital upgrades to many parts of our infrastructure. And let me just give you one example: electric vehicle charging infrastructure. Think about it. We're entering a new phase when more and more consumers want to be driving electric vehicles, but the fleet can only grow as fast as the electric vehicle charging infrastructure grows. So provisions in the bill that would jumpstart investments in electric vehicle charging can make a huge difference in how we move forward.
So I'm wondering, how is Siemens involved? And maybe the charging station is a good example. I think a lot of people might ask, well, Siemens and infrastructure, I'm not really sure how to make the connection here.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me share with you how Siemens has been involved for many, many decades. And with a workforce of 40,000 people across the U.S., we're present in every state and most territories of the United States. And we're doing things like building infrastructure. You know that our cities today are becoming more interconnected. We want to be able to have systems that help to drive information flow from building to electric grid connected to transportation systems. And Siemens is engaged in all of those efforts. So as an infrastructure company, we want to use our voice to think beyond concrete and steel and think now to the digitalization of everything and how this interconnectedness, this creation of smart infrastructure can actually transform our businesses.
Okay, so Barbara, why don't we dig into that? I mean, digitalization and infrastructure. I mean, listen, I speak to steel companies all the time and steel workers. They're not exactly getting down to the nitty gritty of talking about digital when it comes to infrastructure. They're just talking bridges and roads and like you said, commercial office buildings. So can you make a connection there and explain to people really what that's talking about?
For sure. Yeah, well, let's think about it first in how things are made. Yes, we are going to need steel, but we need steel production to be more sustainable. And we have new technologies coming into steel production that will actually reduce the carbon emissions from steel, et cetera. Digitalization is helping us do that. New tools that give us more control over the industrial processes. But there's more. Once we actually build that infrastructure by using sensor technologies, we're able to get better feedback about how the infrastructure is working. When a train pulls into Penn Station in New York, there are some 600 data points on that locomotive that are feeding information back to operators. And so keeping our infrastructure performing on time and efficiently is actually enabled by digitalization.
So like you're saying, in a lot of ways, we'll have better information of maybe when trains are breaking down or when bridges need some sort of repairs. I guess that's really what you're getting at.
Well, that's exactly right. And we've seen this in all kinds of businesses. Look back over this last decade, and you've seen how we've used technological innovations to create the Internet of people. Now we're in a decade where we'll be having people connect the Internet of what I call the Internet of really big things. And it really is going to be transformative in each and every one of our markets.
Moving away from just the domestic market, I mean, how is it that public actions will affect private companies here' ability to operate internationally?
Well, we have to think holistically at this moment. And over the last 2 years, we've had this incredible disruption brought on by COVID, but there were disruptions already underway. One of the things I'd really like us to focus on is the idea that there are better answers to how we can manufacture things. Now, think about this global supply chain. Globalization has been a theme for many decades now, and it seemed that industrial players were searching the globe for where is the lowest cost labor pool that I can have access to so I can produce my goods. It's been the law of mass production, and low cost labor has been moving production capabilities from place to place around the world. What if the future is different? What if what makes the difference now is actually speed to need? You know how during COVID, we had this moment where we wondered, where are we going to produce ventilators? Well, that kind of question is being asked all over the place. Manufacturers everywhere are saying, how can I be more regional? And now we're talking about globalization, the idea that we actually can take advantage of global innovations, but implement our production many places around the world. It's not an or, it's not a reshoring, it's an and, where manufacturers are choosing to distribute their production capabilities on a more regional basis. Now, when we do that, there are a couple things that happen. One, we are actually creating a more resilient supply chain. And then second, we're in many cases actually making those supply chains more sustainable, where their impact on the planet is far less. I think in the future where we're headed is mass customization rather than mass production. So, if we think about this, there is a real transformation going on. Now, how are global governments handling this? We're in a moment where we really have to think carefully about creating a level playing field around the globe, and we can see those kinds of discussions happening. If we can create fair and open bases for trade, then we really can make well-informed decisions about where best to manufacture goods.
Yeah, and can you maybe drill down a bit as to how this is different from, like you said, onshoring or reshoring? I mean, this is a huge topic within the Biden administration, and some days it feels like all they want to do is just bring all supply chains back to the United States. You seem to be saying maybe not. That's not the answer, but something that's a little more targeted.
Yeah, I do think the Biden administration has wonderful goals, and the goal of actually being capable of manufacturing the things that we need. It's a matter of national security now. And we've seen that. We've seen what happens when we are, sort of at the mercy of supply chains where our goods are coming from a portion of the world that is literally shut down because of a pandemic. So knowing that we need to have the capability to make things in the U.S., the Biden administration is taking steps that are helping to accelerate that. But it is a process, and they understand that as well. So we're in a moment, a transitional moment, where yes, we are importing quite a bit from elsewhere, and I think we always will. But we're selecting really important elements in the supply chain where it's wise to make investments, bring the capability to make them in the U.S. And I think the thing everybody's working on is what are the right incentives and disincentives, carrots and sticks, to help people choose to make their investments in the things that we absolutely need right now. Hey, the CHIPS Act is a great example of this. We know we need to produce more semiconductors here in the United States. Look at all of the industries that are reliant on semiconductors, and our ability here in the U.S. has shrunk dramatically over the last couple of decades. Now, turn that around with some jumpstart investment, and what we'll see is a thriving supply chain. It will lift the boats of other industries that are dependent on that, a really wise investment.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of people would agree with you. I mean, I guess the tough part is figuring out how you get to the point of making that investment and kind of targeting exactly what it is you're going to do, right? I mean, the chip shortage you give an example of is kind of the anecdote of the past year and a half pandemic plus supply chain snags plus developing infrastructure that seems to be at this nexus of what the Biden administration is going after.
That's right. And they recognize it will take time. There's some really cool stuff going on, though, led by the administration. Now, think about it. What we realize here in the U.S., we've got the best system in the world, right? We recognize that innovation and growth is best driven by the public sector. And what we need from government is lightweight frameworks that will help set the stage for that kind of really open competition. And so when it comes to things like semiconductor shortages, one of the things the White House and Department of Commerce are facilitating is open data sharing amongst those who use semiconductors in the industry. Just like we do in cybersecurity, we see that it's in our common best interest to communicate openly about the risks we're encountering and where we see opportunities. And then what that helps is by helping the entire industry, we actually help elevate the game for everyone. Now, I would say over this last couple of years, the real heroes in industry have been our supply chain and logistics experts. And this is a moment when we really are letting them shine, because so many of the decisions we need to make about where to invest and how to devote our people, where to place our people for maximum effectiveness, really is all about bottlenecks in the supply chain.
I want to go back to digital, and I want to focus again back on rebuilding America. And, I think a lot of people want to know, how will digital manufacturing, help in rebuilding the country?
Yeah, over the last few years, I've often heard people worry about whether the robots are coming to take our jobs. And the fact is, nothing could be further from the truth. It's exactly the opposite. We are at a really fantastic moment. Siemens has been part of every industrial revolution, and we've seen a world where the industrial revolution shaped the way we live, lifted people out of poverty, made communities thrive. And here we are on the cusp of this next revolution in which we bring the digital tools into manufacturing. And what does it do? Well, if we're able to automate repetitive, dangerous tasks, frankly, boring tasks. We are able to take those things off of the plates of people. And by the way, many of those tasks are the very reason why we had offshoring in the past few years, because people were looking for the lowest cost labor to do those kinds of jobs. Now, what if those jobs actually can be done more effectively with automation in factories? We elevate the role of people in that whole equation. So what I'm excited about is the fact that digitalization is going to bring us the capability to build things differently. As I said earlier, the idea of taking advantage of innovation that's happening elsewhere and then taking digital plans, digital plots for processes, and bringing them into more regional hubs for actual manufacturing, perhaps using additive manufacturing, 3D printing, in order to make things in a new and different way. What we're going to find is that our manufacturing footprint can actually be lighter. We can set it up closer to to hubs where people want to live and play. We can, because it'll be cleaner, more efficient, and then the role that people will be playing in that is much more taking advantage of what we bring as humans: creativity, excitement, entertainment, joy. So I know it's strange to be talking about joy in the field of manufacturing, but my prediction is that it will only be a few years from now when the main jobs we have in a factory are going to look a lot more like playing a video game than in the past of dangerous, dark, and dirty.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the obvious follow-up I think a lot of people want to ask is quite simply, what about the jobs? I mean, you gave a little bit of a hint at it, which is video games. I've heard this before, especially in the mining sector, right? A lot of mining companies want to hire people actually with pretty good knowledge of video gaming. Maybe you could go into that a little bit more.
Yeah, and maybe a good way to tell the story is through the eyes of Corey Scales, a manager in one of our plants. He started at a time when people would come in and take a job, entry level, and work their way up the chain. He himself has worked his way up to be a manager in one of our factories, and he tells the story of the fear when people started to see digital tools coming to the factory. Is this going to replace us? What he discovered is actually using digital tools allowed us to be more productive. Wow, by being more productive, we brought down the cost of our products. We could actually be more competitive as well. That brought on more volume. This has been a virtuous cycle that really has allowed him and his team to build their business. What kinds of things are they doing? They're programming equipment that's actually taking some of the repetitive tasks in that factory and doing them more repeatably with quality and without the safety issues we've been dealing with. And so through the eyes of someone like Corey, you see this evolution. You see the career development that comes through the introduction of new tools and techniques. So Corey is just one of many in our organization who are embracing these tools and encouraging others to do the same.
In the beginning of our conversation, we talked about, on the infrastructure front, we were talking about charging stations for electric vehicles. And I want to ask, how does a modernizing infrastructure plan really affect this supposed new era of electric vehicle use?
Yeah, well, first of all, the modern infrastructure is going to be more electric, more connected, and more automated. And we're seeing this in so many different sectors, and transportation being, one of the primary examples. I hear a lot of concerns from people that, hey, I'd buy an electric car, except I'm not sure about whether I'd be able to charge it when I need to charge it. I've got range anxiety. And so what we've recognized is that we're going to need to build out that electric vehicle charging station, much like you might say, hey, there's a gas station on every corner, right? We want to be able to charge our vehicles and know that we can get where we need to be. Now, there are some problems with this because in the early days of electric charging, what we've seen is some private companies stand up and build proprietary systems. And that's all well and good. If you're within a region where a particular provider has put in a system and you can go from point to point and charge your vehicle, that's great. But what happens when you then want to go to a different region and find that there's a different proprietary system? That's just not going to work for a nation like the US. And so what we're going to need are open standards for the kinds of equipment that we need to use as part of infrastructure. Charging is one of those, but you can imagine there are others where we say we want this to be a new part of the backbone of our infrastructure. When it comes to electric vehicle charging, then, we've got to move quickly to roll out chargers. We at Siemens have made the commitment to build another 1 million electric vehicle chargers right here in the United States. And so we have one location in Wendell, North Carolina, where we're manufacturing chargers. We've deployed over 75,000 now, but we're actually going to be working elsewhere in the country and expanding that capability as well. We've been a loud voice for open standards. In this digital world, the ability to plug and play, the ability to hook into multiple systems and be able to really expand the reach is absolutely vital in our minds.
Yeah, I mean, it's about keeping America moving, right? And I think the follow-up to that is EVs. Obviously, we're thinking more kind of consumer focused, but what about businesses in America and how a modern infrastructure will improve their operations, but also supply chains, right? I mean, I think the number one thing being discussed right now on company earnings calls is supply chain snags here in the US. They're awful, and people are expecting them to last for at least another year.
Yeah. Well, this is why we've been so pleased that the bipartisan infrastructure framework really does have a focus on ports of all kinds. I mean, look at the Port of Los Angeles right now and the real dilemma of how to move adequate goods through that port to support the rest of the ecosystem. So, modern infrastructure, if we are successful in getting this more connected and more autonomous infrastructure, we will have the ability to perhaps move things via rail, and beginning to hear signals of the introduction of high-speed rail in the U.S., an important step for us. We're seeing signs of greater air infrastructure being expanded out, which gives us more alternatives for the way we move cargo. And then, of course, we're beginning to see signals of more electric fleets for large vehicles, whether it's an electrified highway or whether it is, vans and large vehicles that are electrified and moving goods for us. All of that is more sustainable. And again, as I say, if we focus on a more regional manufacturing hub, then we take some of the stress off of the long-range transportation requirements and really focus in more on the short haul. These are all objectives we share across the industry.
Barbara, I want to get one more question in here with you. And, looking ahead, if it was up to you, the first dollars you spend on new infrastructure updates, where would they go?
Hands down, they would go into the grid. Think about it. The grid is the most complex machine ever built. And everything else we do is built on that backbone of electricity. Our ability to manage the reliable flow of electricity into all of our industries is vital to our nation. So I'm really a strong proponent for greater grid resilience. And a big part of that comes in the low and medium voltage part of our grid, the distribution systems, the introduction of technologies like microgrids and nanogrids. And then this integration from building to transportation systems so that we have a more interconnected grid that can then also manage the supply of renewable energies that are growing all across the nation.
Yeah, and I guess that's really kind of the key here, right, is building out a new grid that can begin to handle the massive amount of energy storage we'll need from those renewable energies. No?
That's exactly right.
Barbara, thank you so much for your time with us. I think we've learned a lot more about infrastructure We've been talking about it for many years, but to see it finally on the doorstep is quite interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you all for joining the first edition of Policy Blueprint. We hope you enjoyed these conversations. Thank you so much to our special guests and contributors. We'll be airing replays of these interviews on Bloomberg Television, radio, Quick Take, and you can find the conversations, of course, on Bloomberg's live social media pages. Please engage with us by using the hashtag Policy Blueprint. Thanks again to all our speakers for a wonderful program. And thank you to our founding sponsor, Microsoft, for making this virtual event possible. If you'd like more information from our sponsor, please visit the resources tab on your screen. And most of all, thank you to all of you for being such an engaged audience. It was our absolute pleasure. And thanks for watching.